One of the absolute greatest triumphs in the history of independent gaming did not begin with a grand vision of a sprawling subterranean kingdom or a legendary warrior of silent resolve. Instead, it stumbled into existence as a bug-eating simulator that almost every player who touched it absolutely hated. Long before the haunting, beautiful halls of Hallownest took their iconic shape, a scrappy, tiny prototype emerged from the chaotic energy of a game jam, and it nearly vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Back in the sweltering heat of August 2013, the visionary minds behind what would become Team Cherry decided to participate in the Ludum Dare 27 competition. They crafted a strange little experience called Hungry Night. In this frantic, primitive world, you played as a small creature that had to kill other bugs every 10 seconds, or you would simply starve to death. It was a stressful, punishing, and somewhat repetitive cycle that didn't exactly scream future masterpiece. When the project eventually hit the digital shelves of Newgrounds in 2014, the reviews were far from kind. In fact, they were largely terrible. Critics and players alike found the mechanics frustrating and the concept thin. But the developers, Ari Gibson and William Pellin, found something in that little bug that they simply couldn't shake. They loved their creation with a fierce, stubborn devotion and flatly refused to let the idea die on the vine. They eventually decided to try their hand at another game jam, this time with a theme focusing on things hidden beneath the surface. Ironically, they actually missed the deadline for this second competition, failing to enter their work at all. Yet in a twist of fate that feels like pure alchemy, that specific failure turned into absolute gold. The missed opportunity forced them to sit with their ideas longer, and from the quiet disappointment of that skipped deadline, the concept of an expansive underground bug kingdom was born. One of the best indie games ever to grace a screen was essentially forged from the wreckage of a trash idea and a contest they didn't even participate in. It is a testament to the fact that creativity often thrives in the gaps between our intended successes. As this seedling of an idea began to grow into something much more ambitious, the survival of the project itself came down to scraps, immense personal sacrifice, and a massive support system. When they launched their Kickstarter campaign, they weren't asking for millions. They were hoping for enough just to keep the lights on. The campaign barely cleared 58,000 AUD, which, in the expensive and volatile world of professional game development, is essentially considered pocket change. It is an amount that many large studios would spend on a single marketing meeting or a few pieces of high-end equipment. To make this work, the development team had to live a life of extreme austerity. They survived on leftovers, small bills tucked into envelopes by William's father, and the unique luck of living in a cheap Adelaide office where the rent was low enough that it didn't crush their spirits. While the guys poured every ounce of their energy, soul, and time into the world of Hollow Knight, their partners worked steady jobs, quietly keeping food on the table and providing the emotional and financial stability required to keep the dream alive. It wasn't just raw passion that built the foundations of Hallownest. It was a complex and humble support network of family, lovers, and the sheer luck of being in the right city at the right time. Without that specific safety net, the game likely would have crumbled before it ever reached a playable state. But aside from this incredible human support system, there were other factors that allowed the team to actually finish a project of this massive scale. Before the world knew him as one of the architects of the Knight's journey, Ari Gibson ran a successful animation studio. The profits from that previous business venture became the essential seed money that allowed the game to start its life. That early financial cushion gave Team Cherry a rare and valuable opportunity, the chance to take significant risks without the immediate threat of starving. They could spend weeks iterating on a single animation or a specific room layout because they weren't constantly staring at a bank balance of zero. Furthermore, the specialized skills Ari had honed in the animation industry carried over directly into the game's distinctive, hand-drawn art style. The financial stability didn't just buy them food, it bought them the most precious resource of all, time. It is a perfect example of how one creative career can provide the fuel and the foundation for another. Hollow Knight wasn't a miracle born from a void. It was built on years of professional experience in a different but adjacent industry. This blend of personal savings and high-level skill became the bedrock upon which the ruins of Hallownest would be built. Past successes made these new, more daring dreams possible, but those big swings still had to be executed by a very tiny crew. The core team of Hollow Knight is often spoken of as a three-person miracle, and while that isn't perfectly accurate, it is shockingly close. Ari Gibson was the artistic powerhouse, responsible for drawing every single frame, background, and character you see. William Pellin was the mastermind behind the gameplay design, ensuring that every jump and slash felt right. David Kazi was the technical backbone, handling the complex logic and programming until his departure in 2017. However, the team also saw Jack Vine join as a programmer to help bridge the technical gaps, and the haunting, atmospheric music was crafted by Christopher Larkin, who worked as a dedicated contractor. Even with these additional hands, it remained a vanishingly small group for a game of such immense depth. This handful of people managed to create a world that felt like it had been produced by a studio of hundreds. They worked out of that one small, humble office in Adelaide, living on a diet of passion and the cheapest food they could find. Every intricate idea, every punishing boss fight, and every hidden secret was the result of a few dedicated people in a room together. That reality is, in many ways, more impressive than any hidden piece of content within the game itself. Even with such a tiny crew, every single movement the Knight makes was calculated down to the precise frame. While the various bug voices you hear throughout the world were largely the result of playful improvisation, the movement system itself was a case of very deliberate and open inspiration. Or, as the team sometimes jokes, straight-up theft. Team Cherry has never been shy about admitting that they looked very closely at the movement in Mega Man X when they were building their protagonist. They wanted that specific feeling of digital movement found in old NES and SNES classics, rather than the realistic, momentum-based physics found in many modern titles. They stripped away acceleration, ensuring that the Knight reached top speed the instant you pushed the direction. They designed instant direction changes and a dash that could cancel almost any other action. William Pellin explained that they wanted a world where every hit felt avoidable until the very last possible second. The goal was to give the player total, uncompromising control over their character. This is why high-level speedrunners can perform those breathtaking, frame-perfect dodges. Because the movement isn't fighting against a physics engine. It is operating with the precision of a 1990s platformer. They even cited Mega Man X8 as an inspiration, which is a fascinatingly obscure choice since that particular entry in the franchise is rarely discussed in such high regard. Your little Bug Knight is, in many ways, just a Mega Man character wearing a very dark and melancholy Halloween costume. If the controls were a respectful nod to the Blue Bomber, the roots of the world's structure came from an even more unexpected place. Everyone loves to compare the atmosphere and difficulty of Hollow Knight to the Dark Souls series, but Team Cherry has pointed out that their primary inspiration was actually an ancient NES game from 1987 called Faxanadu. This obscure title involves exploring a massive world tree that has been infected by evil forces. Team Cherry took that vertical concept and simply flipped it on its head. Instead of climbing up into the sky, they wanted the player to descend deeper and deeper into the cooling crust of the earth. The fundamental hook of a mysterious lone warrior arriving at a decaying, cursed kingdom is a trope they pulled directly from the DNA of Faxanadu. The only reason the Dark Souls comparison stuck so heavily in the minds of the public is the mechanic of dropping your currency when you die. In reality, the developers were likely exhausted by the constant Souls-like comparisons when their actual heart was in the 8-bit era of their childhood. Along with these throwback roots, the team also looked toward the legendary Paper Mario series for their charm system. While some elements of the game were happy accidents, the way you equip powers was a very deliberate adaptation of Nintendo's homework. The charm system that players obsess over is essentially a direct evolution of the badge system from Paper Mario. You have a limited number of slots, you mix and match various powers, and more powerful abilities take up more of your precious space. It is the exact same foundational logic, just rethemed with insects and ancient stones. Team Cherry did, however, add their own twist with the overcharm mechanic, which allows a player to force more power into their build at the cost of taking double damage. Originally, they had thought about making charms permanent upgrades, but they realized that was boring and lacked tactical depth. By borrowing the flexible system from a game about a paper plumber, they created one of the most beloved and customizable parts of the entire experience. Sometimes, the most brilliant ideas are simply the ones you are smart enough to borrow and refine. Not every nod to the classics was subtle, though. Some parts of the game are genuine love letters to the icons of the past. If you look at the boss Grimm and his specific attack patterns, you are looking at a direct tribute to Dracula from the Castlevania series. The way his cape opens to fire projectiles, the pillars of flame that erupt from the ground, and the fire bats that swarm the player are all classic Dracula moves. Team Cherry didn't even try to hide the connection. The entire Grimm Troop expansion is essentially a gothic horror story infused with vampire DNA. Grimm is Dracula reimagined as a bug performing a ritualistic theater piece. The developers wore these influences proudly, demonstrating that the best design often involves taking something iconic and putting a unique, creative spin on it. They figured out that Bug Dracula was somehow more unsettling than the regular version because, let's be honest, bugs are already inherently creepy to many people. That same deep love for history and classics manifested in the game's visuals as well. The user interface isn't just a collection of random design choices. It is a study in architectural history. Team Cherry actually spent time looking at Gothic cathedral architecture to help create the menus, icons, and borders that define the player's HUD. The sharp, arrow-like shapes and decorative flourishes all echo the design of medieval churches. Most players might not realize it as they pause to check their map, but they are staring at centuries of architectural influence translated into a digital medium. The result is a style that feels both ancient and remarkably modern at the same time. This blending of historic art with the needs of a modern video game created a unique visual identity that helped the project stand out in a crowded market. It is a perfect mixture of high culture and raw creativity. As the scope of the project continued to balloon, Team Cherry realized they couldn't handle every technical hurdle on their own. This is where the collaborative spirit of the Australian indie scene really began to shine. Another group of talented developers known as Shark Jump Studios stepped in to help with the incredibly difficult task of porting the game to various consoles. Without their technical support, it is entirely possible that the Knight's Journey would have remained a PC-only experience. Instead of competing for limited resources, these studios work together, proving that independent companies can thrive when they share knowledge and technical labor. Players across PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch gained a much smoother and more polished experience because of this quiet teamwork. It is a shining example of how small developers can lift each other up. The strength of the Australian development community often comes from this spirit of cooperation, and the success of this title is a direct reflection of that ethos. External forces also played a massive role in how the game eventually reached the public. Many people forget that the game actually began its development life with the Wii U in mind. However, when Nintendo eventually moved away from that console to make room for the Switch, Team Cherry found themselves at a crossroads. They had to pivot their entire strategy, which meant a significant amount of extra work during an already stressful development cycle. In hindsight, however, this hardware transition likely saved the game from obscurity. While the Wii U had a dedicated but small audience, the Switch became a global phenomenon. By moving their focus to the new platform, they found an audience that was hungry for high-quality, portable experiences. It shows how fragile the life of an indie game can be. Sometimes your ultimate success depends not just on the quality of your work, but on whether the hardware you chose survives long enough for people to actually buy your game. Despite all the chaos of platform changes and technical shifts, the art remains stubbornly human. The visuals of the game weren't heavily cleaned up with sterile digital lines. Instead, Ari Gibson's original hand-drawn sketches were scanned directly into the software. This allowed the game to retain the texture, imperfections, and soul of traditional art. If you look closely at certain backgrounds or character designs, you can see the faint hints of pencil strokes and the little quirks of a human hand. In an era where many games chase a kind of flawless, plastic perfection, Team Cherry chose to embrace the human touch. This is why the world of Hallownest feels so warm and organic, even in its most desolate and terrifying corners. You can feel the presence of the artist in every line. It feels handcrafted because, at its very core, it truly is. From those handmade lines came a world that feels incredibly deep, despite being a 2D experience. The game uses a clever trick involving 3 distinct layers of art: the foreground, the midground, and the background. By moving each of these layers at a slightly different speed, a technique known as parallax scrolling, they created the illusion of a massive 3-dimensional space. It makes the caves feel like they stretch back for miles, and the cities feel as though they tower over the player, all without the need for expensive or complex 3D rendering. It is a smart, efficient use of artistic perspective that tricks the brain into feeling totally immersed in a flat world. Team Cherry proved that you don't need massive budgets or cutting-edge technology to create a sense of scale. You just need a deep understanding of how to use art to manipulate the player's perception. That sense of depth only works, however, because the team prioritized readability above all else. They established a rule that the most detailed layer of any scene must be the one where the gameplay actually takes place. The backgrounds were kept relatively simple, and the foreground elements were often rendered as light silhouettes, so they wouldn't block the player's view of the action. This was a very deliberate choice. During a frantic boss battle or a difficult platforming section, the player needs to clearly see the hazards, the enemies, and the knight's position. If the entire world were overly cluttered with detail, the experience would feel unfair and frustrating. By designing with this kind of clarity in mind, Team Cherry ensured that the game always feels challenging but fair. The visuals are stunningly beautiful, but they never come at the expense of the actual experience of playing. It is a masterclass in putting the player's needs before pure artistic ego. Taking that philosophy of clarity even further, the developers discovered that they could use the environment itself to quietly steer the player without ever needing to rely on intrusive markers or flashing arrows. The black silhouettes, often found in the very front of the screen, the foreground elements, are not merely there for aesthetic style or to create a sense of framing. They are actually a sophisticated tool used to guide where you move without you even realizing that your path is being influenced. Team Cherry placed these dark, jagged shapes in very specific ways that naturally draw your eye toward an opening or push you away from a dead end. As you navigate the winding caverns, you feel like you are exploring with total freedom, making your own choices at every crossroads, but the underlying level design is quietly acting as an invisible hand. Instead of using artificial icons, the shadows and shapes of the world itself keep you on the right track. It is a brilliant way to guide the traveler while still allowing the ancient kingdom to feel vast, mysterious, and untamed. You believe you are making every decision based on your own curiosity, but in reality, the environment is working like a subtle, silent tour guide, whispering where the next adventure lies. If the shadows act as the walls of the path, then the way the team used lighting is what makes the human brain follow those paths so naturally. Humans, by their very nature, are instinctively drawn toward light in a dark environment, and this project uses that primal instinct with incredible precision. The night itself possesses a very faint, ghostly glow that illuminates the immediate surroundings, but it is the placement of stationary light sources that truly defines the flow of exploration. Ancient, flickering lanterns or glowing crystalline growths are often positioned near important paths, hidden shortcuts, or significant landmarks. Without even thinking about it, the player is pulled toward these pools of brightness, often ending up exactly where the designers intended them to go. You never feel forced or railroaded because the movement feels like a natural response to the atmosphere. Darkness in this world is designed to make you cautious and hesitant, while the presence of light ignites curiosity and offers a sense of safety. That delicate balance keeps the momentum of exploration smooth and rewarding without the need for quest markers or a minimap that clutters the screen. You are following your own survival instincts rather than a set of instructions, which makes the entire journey feel organic, immersive, and deeply personal. Building on that instinctual navigation, the team developed a rigorous color palette that functions like a compass for the player's understanding of the world. In the muted, often monochromatic depths of the underground, white is reserved as the rarest and most significant color. The night itself is primarily white, as are the most important non-player characters and the most vital objects in the environment. Against the somber blues, grays, and earthy browns of the ruins, anything white immediately pops out with a sharp, undeniable clarity. Team Cherry designed the world this way so that players could learn the rules of the environment without ever being told a single word of instruction. When you see a flash of white in the distance, you instantly know through hours of subconscious training that it is something worth your time and attention. The color itself becomes a silent signal, training your brain to prioritize certain visual information over others. Instead of using flashy, immersion-breaking icons, the game relies on this internal consistency. That choice makes the kingdom feel like a real natural place while still providing the player with crystal clear guidance at a single glance. If white represents the light of importance, then the deep, pure black of the world defines exactly what the player should fear and respect. Whenever you encounter a patch of true, bottomless black, it almost always signifies the presence of the void. The developers kept this visual rule remarkably consistent throughout the entire experience, never deviating from the association. Over time, as you delve deeper into the history of the Fallen Kingdom, you begin to link that specific color to the ancient lore and the strange, shadowy creatures tied to the origins of the world. This consistency creates a visual language that communicates complex narrative ideas without the need for a single line of dialogue or a lengthy scroll of text. You understand the gravity and the meaning of a location just by observing its color profile. Black isn't just a background shade in this context. It carries immense weight, history, and a sense of existential dread. By reserving this specific tone for the void, the team ensured that their symbolism remains strong and unmistakable. It shows how even the simplest choices in a color palette can hold deep narrative importance if they are applied with discipline and vision. Contrasting sharply against that cold, black void is the screaming, vibrant orange of the infection. This choice was perhaps the most vital in the entire visual identity of the project. The orange glow of the corruption stands out instantly in a world that is otherwise dominated by cool tones and shadows. This wasn't a random aesthetic choice. Team Cherry specifically selected orange because it feels loud, unnatural, and inherently dangerous in a subterranean setting. The contrast is so sharp that infected areas look physically sick and pulsating even before the first enemy appears on the screen. It taps into a deep-seated psychological reaction where certain hues make us feel instinctively uncomfortable or alert. The moment that orange hue bleeds into the corner of your vision, you know that the area has been corrupted by the plague. It also serves a practical gameplay purpose, allowing players to spot danger zones and hazardous projectiles with lightning speed. The color itself does the work of warning the player, removing the need for text-based alerts or interface warnings. It is a simple, effective, and unforgettable design choice that makes the tragedy of the infection impossible to ignore. Interestingly, that iconic, terrifying orange glow actually had a hilariously gross origin story during the early days of development. Believe it or not, there was a time when the team referred to the infection as rotten pizza cheese. The melted, stringy, and somewhat gloopy look of the corruption in its early stages really did resemble spoiled, overheated cheese in a way that the developers found both funny and effective. While it might sound like a silly anecdote, it actually works because it gives the corruption a physical, sticky, and visceral vibe that players can instantly relate to on a sensory level. Everyone knows what bad food looks like, and by tapping into that common revulsion, they made the supernatural plague feel grounded and repulsive. That small internal joke eventually evolved into a powerful artistic choice that shaped the visual identity of entire regions of the world. It serves as a great reminder that even the most ridiculous or mundane inspirations can lead to incredible world building when they are refined through a creative lens. Rotten pizza cheese never looked so haunting or atmospheric as it does in the halls of the Crossroads. Before they finally landed on that specific shade of orange, the team actually experimented with more traditional disease colors, but they quickly tossed them aside. Most games, when they want to show poison, toxicity, or a spreading plague, will default to shades of sickly green or deep purple. Team Cherry tried these traditional palettes during the prototype phase, but they found that the results felt too generic and predictable. They didn't want their world to look like every other fantasy adventure on the market. They wanted something that would sear itself into the player's memory. That is why they moved away from the cliches of green and purple and embraced the intensity of orange. Against the darker, cooler tones of the underground, the orange felt more intense, more invasive, and more memorable. Now, players instantly recognize that specific glow as being unique to this world, and it doesn't blend in with the common tropes of the genre. Choosing originality over the safe, well-worn path of cliches made the world feel distinct and gave it a visual signature that remains one of its most recognizable features. Once the colors and the atmosphere were established, the team used the silent remains of the world to tell the story of its downfall. Every skeleton, every husk, and every suit of armor you find scattered across the landscape has been carefully and deliberately placed. These aren't just random decorations intended to fill up empty space or make a room look gothic. They are environmental clues that hint at the specific tragedies that occurred in those locations. A fallen guard slumped near a heavy, broken gate suggests a desperate last stand against an overwhelming force. A body curled tightly into a corner suggests someone who tried to hide from the madness and failed. These tiny, silent details allow the player to piece together the history of the kingdom without ever needing to read a lore entry or listen to an explanation. It makes the world feel alive and tragic at the same time, as though you are walking through the aftermath of a massive civilization-ending event. Instead of the game spelling out every event, you are invited to be an archaeologist of the apocalypse, reading the history of the bugs through their final resting places. If the corpses tell the story of the end, then the moss and the overgrowth act as the timeline of the decay. The moss growing across the ruins of Hallownest isn't just there for the sake of atmosphere, it actually functions as a visual clock. The team used different layers and thicknesses of plant life to mark how long a particular area has been abandoned. Fresh, vibrant green moss suggests that a place was still active until fairly recently, while thick, dusty layers of overgrowth indicate centuries of slow, quiet decay. By paying close attention to the flora, an observant player can actually figure out the relative age of different ruins or how long a particular skeleton has been sitting in its final spot. It makes the act of exploration feel like you are uncovering layers of history, one patch of moss at a time. Nature itself tells you the age of the kingdom, turning every mossy wall and overgrown pillar into a witness to the passage of time since the kingdom's collapse. Outside of the digital experience itself, the physical manual that accompanied the early versions of the game captured that same sense of preserved history. The manual was far more than just a list of buttons and basic instructions. It was a treasure trove of concept art and sketches that revealed how the characters and the world had evolved over time. Some of the designs looked remarkably different before they reached their final iconic forms, and seeing that progression gave fans a rare peek behind the curtain. It showed the iteration, the mistakes, and the refinements that were necessary to bring the night to life. In an era where most digital games release and their early drafts vanish into hidden folders forever, this manual preserved the creative journey of the studio. It turned a simple instructional booklet into a piece of artistic history, providing inspiration for future artists and designers by showing that even a masterpiece begins with rough, uncertain sketches. That habit of refining and trimming almost led to the loss of the music that we now consider inseparable from the experience. It is hard to imagine the haunting atmosphere of the City of Tears or the frantic energy of a boss fight without the incredible soundtrack, but Christopher Larkin wasn't actually supposed to be involved from the very beginning. In fact, he only joined the project after the Kickstarter campaign succeeded beyond the team's initial expectations, and they realized they had enough extra money to hire a professional composer. Before that financial boost, Team Cherry was considering making the music themselves, or perhaps using generic stock tracks to save money. Luckily, Larkin brought a massive amount of musical education and classical training to the table. His father was a classical conductor, and Christopher had studied at a prestigious music school in Adelaide, bringing a level of sophistication that is rare in the indie scene. This guy brought real high-level musical theory to a game about bugs fighting in the dirt. We very nearly lived in a world where this masterpiece was accompanied by generic elevator music instead of the orchestral triumph we eventually received. While the team brought in a professional for the music, the voice acting remained a hilariously amateur and homemade affair. Nearly all of those iconic bug voices you hear throughout the world are just William and Ari making weird, exaggerated noises into a microphone in their small office. Almost every male character in the game is simply one of the developers going bapanada or making grunting sounds in different pitches and tones. The female characters were largely voiced by their friend Makoto Koji, who performed the lines for Hornet, the Mantis Lords, and even the unsettling, screaming Fluke Marm. It is a testament to her range that the same person who voiced the cool, noble warrior princess also provided the bone-chilling screeches for a massive, pulsating flesh mother. The bug language itself isn't a real language with grammar or syntax. It is entirely improvised gibberish. However, that hasn't stopped the dedicated fanbase from spending years trying to decode it, creating elaborate translation guides and linguistic dictionaries. The developers must have spent countless hours laughing as they watched people overanalyze their random mouth noises as if they were ancient, sacred texts. If the voices were homemade, the sound design was equally grounded in mundane human reality. One of the most satisfying and iconic sounds in the entire game is the deep, echoing sigh the knight makes when sitting on a bench. That sound was created by simply having one of the developers exhale tiredly into a microphone and then applying a few digital effects to give it weight and resonance. They had tried dozens of other options: metal clanging sounds, stone grinding against stone, magical chimes, but nothing felt quite right. Then, someone just let out a genuine, exhausted sigh, and the team realized it was perfect. Millions of players have now heard that sigh thousands of times, and it has become synonymous with the feeling of relief after a difficult section of the game. It is a perfect fit because after some of those punishing platforming challenges, both the player and the knight truly need a moment of literal and figurative rest. Sometimes the most effective piece of sound design is just a simple, honest human expression of fatigue. Once the basic structure was in place, the team's experiments with audio got strange very quickly. Those wet, disgusting infection sounds that make your skin crawl, they were created in the most low-budget way imaginable. Those horrible noises are essentially just recordings of people breathing very heavily and very close to a microphone, with a heavy layer of distortion and reverb thrown on top. Team Cherry didn't have the budget to hire a massive Foley studio or specialized voice actors, so they got creative with their own lungs. They would sit in their tiny recording space and breathe in the most bizarre, labored ways they could imagine, then twist the audio until it sounded like something from a nightmare. The bone-chilling scream of the broken vessel, for example, is just a recording of heavy breathing that was pitched way up until it sounded alien. Even the unsettling background drone in the infected crossroads is just layers of human breathing played at different speeds. This means that if you've played for dozens of hours, you've basically spent that entire time listening to the developers hyperventilating into a mic. From those breathy horrors came one of the most beloved and gentle sounds in the game: Cornifer's distinctive humming. This sound, which acts as a beacon of safety for players lost in the dark, was completely improvised during a recording session. The voice actor just started humming a random tune between takes, and the developers loved it so much they decided to keep it as a core part of the character. It wasn't in any script or planning document, but it was a moment of pure spontaneous creativity that changed the game. Now, that humming has become one of the most recognizable sounds in indie gaming. Players actually use the volume of the hum to triangulate Cornifer's location in new areas, which means this random vocalization accidentally became a vital gameplay mechanic. The team even had to write specific instructions for the audio system to make the humming get louder as the knight approaches him. It is a perfect example of how some of the best design choices happen by accident when people are just having fun in the studio. While Cornifer's humming is designed to calm the player, the area known as Deepnest was engineered to do the exact opposite. Team Cherry wanted this region to feel genuinely oppressive and unpleasant, so they studied horror games to learn how to manipulate the player's psyche through sound. They used layered recordings of skittering spiders, distant heartbeats, and breathing at specific frequencies that are known to cause feelings of anxiety in humans. The darkness in Deepnest isn't just a visual hurdle. The audio is mixed to feel like it is pressing in on you from all sides. If you find yourself wanting to leave that area as quickly as possible, that isn't a flaw in the design. It is a feature. They wanted the player to feel a profound sense of relief the moment they finally step back into the lighter, more melodic parts of the kingdom. It is a masterclass in using psychological manipulation through sound to create a specific emotional response. Building on those emotional highs and lows, the team also had to face the reality of their limited resources, which led to some of the most famous missing content in the game. If you've ever explored the Abyss and felt like it was a bit empty or underdeveloped, your instincts are correct. During the Kickstarter campaign, Team Cherry had promised a massive expansion for the Abyss as a stretch goal, including 4 extra bosses and some of the most difficult challenges in the game. It was supposed to be the definitive lore dump, explaining the horrific origins of the vessels and the nature of the void. However, as development dragged on and the budget remained tight, most of that content had to be axed. Years later, they tried to give the fans a little bit of what was lost with the birthplace cutscene, but we can only imagine what that area would have looked like if they had been able to afford the full vision. The deepest, darkest part of the world was originally intended to be even deeper and far more terrifying. Another fascinating piece of cut content involves the original vision for the Dream Nail. In the early planning stages, the Dream Nail didn't just read the surface thoughts of NPCs. It allowed the knight to literally dive inside their heads. There is actually early footage of the knight chopping off a piece of a character's skull and jumping into their brain as if it were a physical gateway. Every single character in the game was originally going to have their own unique dream world, with specific platforming challenges and memories to explore. You would have been able to see what Cornifer dreams about while he's making his maps, or delve into the forgotten memories of Quirrell. Ultimately, however, the team realized this was an astronomical amount of work that would have delayed the game for years. They decided to scale it back to the small thought bubbles and specific dream bosses we see today. We went from invasive brain surgery exploration to a much simpler form of mind reading, which in retrospect was probably a lot less disturbing for the player. When that idea of diving into brains vanished, several other major promises went with it. One of the most tragic losses was the planned boss fight against Isma. For those who dig into the lore, Isma was one of the 5 great knights who protected the kingdom in its prime. Team Cherry had initially announced her as a full boss fight of Tesar, where the player would face her in a duel of pure nail skill, with no spells allowed. She was supposed to have gone mad after her gardens were destroyed, but still possessed enough honor for a fair fight. Instead, because of time and budget constraints, she was reduced to a piece of scenery, a silent, overgrown body surrounded by defeated enemies. They turned what could have been a legendary showdown into a tragic environmental detail. It is one of those moments where the reality of development forces a studio to turn a hero into a corpse, simply because they don't have the time to animate their attacks. The cuts didn't stop with serious lore either. Some of them were just plain weird. Team Cherry actually spent time creating an entire village of talking snails, complete with little houses built onto their shells. You can actually see glimpses of this in the very early trailers for the game, with full backgrounds and unique character models. However, as the tone of the project became darker and more melancholy, the developers looked at the happy cartoonish snails and decided they didn't fit the mood. They felt that having a village of cheerful tea-drinking snails would ruin the atmosphere of exploring a kingdom full of zombies and tragic sacrifices. Some fans believe that the massive caterpillar, Bardoon, inherited the personality and dialogue that was originally meant for the snails, which explains why he is so strangely relaxed in such a dying world. It is a funny thought to imagine finding a polite tea party in the middle of a plague-ridden wasteland, but the developers prioritized the consistency of their dark vision over a few jokes. That commitment to the atmosphere is also why the White Palace ends with a moment of quiet, for just crushing sadness rather than a massive boss battle. After navigating what many consider the most difficult platforming section in the game, a literal hell of saw blades and spikes, most players expected a final, epic confrontation with the king himself. But Ari Gibson has stated that they never actually planned for a boss fight at the end of that climb. In their minds, the palace itself was the boss. The enemies were the spikes, the moving saws, and the player's own patience. Finding the Pale King already dead and slumped on his throne hits much harder emotionally than a physical fight ever could. It forces the player to realize that their quest for answers has led them to a ghost, a ruler who failed his people and died in isolation. Sometimes the most powerful ending to a challenge is no fight at all, just a sense of profound depression and a dead king. Right after that emotional fake-out in the palace, there was another massive feature that sank beneath the waves before launch. Early trailers showed the knight actually swimming through pools of acid, not just walking on top of them with a special item. This mechanic would have opened up entirely new underwater regions of the map and connected to a quest involving a lighthouse that exists in the game's internal files. There were even plans for underwater boss fights against massive void creatures lurking in the depths of a dark sea. Can you imagine fighting for your life while swimming through liquid darkness? Team Cherry eventually cut the entire swimming system because they realized it would add years to the development cycle. Furthermore, they joked that watching a tiny, armored bug knight do the butterfly stroke looked a bit too ridiculous for the serious tone they were trying to maintain. In this case, cutting a major feature likely saved the game from being stuck in development forever. Hidden within the game's internal file structure today is perhaps the most famous piece of missing content, the Lighthouse Quest. Modders and digital archaeologists have found all the pieces of this mission, which was supposed to take place in a region called the Lake of Void. You would have used the swimming mechanics to navigate through absolute darkness, solving complex puzzles involving light and shadows. There was even a specific NPC, the Lighthouse Keeper, who had his own tragic backstory that the team eventually had to abandon. The fact that this content was removed so late in development means that many of the rooms and assets still exist in the software's architecture. If you use special tools to glitch through the walls, you can find these empty, haunting spaces where the quest was supposed to happen. It is like finding the ruins of a lost civilization within the game itself, a reminder of the massive world that almost was. Once the shoreline of that void lake shrank from a massive ocean to a small puddle, many other things had to change as well. The Abyss, which is already one of the most atmospheric areas in the kingdom, was originally intended to have a massive underwater section. Concept art shows giant, multi-tentacled void krakens lurking in the lightless depths, waiting to grab the knight. Those shadow tendrils that occasionally snatch at you in the final game were supposed to be full, interactive enemies that you would have fought while navigating the water. Team Cherry ended up trading a literal ocean of possibilities for a small, atmospheric lake because they simply had to finish the project. It is a common theme in the story of this game, high-concept ideas being trimmed down into smaller, more manageable moments so that the team could actually release the game to the public. Sometimes those compromises resulted in areas that feel slightly half-finished for a very good reason. For instance, Fog Canyon was nearly cut from the experience entirely. It was added at the very last minute because the team realized they needed a way to connect several other regions of the map together. That is why it feels so much smaller and more distinct from the rest of Hallownest. It was essentially a rushed project to bridge the gaps. The jellyfish enemies were thrown in to give the area a unique flavor, and the decision to place the teacher, Monomon, there was a panicked choice to give the region a story purpose. Originally, she was supposed to be hidden somewhere else entirely. Fog Canyon is in many ways just a beautiful, glowing hallway with deadly jellyfish pretending to be a full-sized region. Sometimes you just need filler to make a world's geography make sense, even if that filler is actively trying to electrocute you. That same last-minute energy is also why the Hive area almost vanished from the game. The Hive is famously disconnected from the rest of the kingdom, sitting in a tucked-away corner that many players never even find. Team Cherry nearly removed it because it didn't really fit into the main narrative arc of the Plague and the King. They only kept it because they had already spent so much time and effort drawing the bee enemies and designing the golden, honey-soaked rooms that they couldn't bear to let the work go to waste. The Hive Knight boss was actually added very late in the process just to give players a reason to be there. Even the Hive Blood charm was a late addition to reward anyone who bothered to explore that optional corner. It feels like a separate minigame because, in many ways, it is. It is content that didn't have a home but was too high quality to delete. Even with the zones in a state of constant flux, the Knight's physical appearance remained grounded in real-world biology. The Knight and the other vessels were heavily inspired by real beetles, particularly the rhinoceros and stag beetle varieties. Their distinctive horns and sturdy body shapes are meant to reflect the natural armor and silhouettes of these real insects. Team Cherry wanted their protagonist to feel like it belonged to the natural world, even if that world was filled with magic and ancient gods. This choice makes the Knight feel both alien and strangely familiar to the player. You might not be thinking about entomology while you're fighting for your life, but that foundation in biology gives the characters a believable, grounded quality. It shows that even in a high fantasy setting, the best designs often have one foot planted in the reality of nature. Following that same biological logic, the number of eyes a creature has tells you everything you need to know about its heritage. In the world of Hallownest, there is a strict rule. If a character has 8 eyes, they are connected to the spiders of Deepnest. This is a simple but incredibly effective way to communicate a creature's origin at a single glance. You don't need a lore book or a long conversation to explain where a monster came from. The design itself does the talking. Once you notice this rule, you start seeing the connections everywhere, and the world begins to feel more consistent and thoughtfully constructed. It is a clever use of biology as a storytelling tool, proving that even the smallest details, like the count of a creature's eyes, can hold significant meaning if the designers are consistent with their rules. Underneath all that taxonomy and biological world building, the hero of the story remains a blank slate on purpose. Team Cherry has been very careful to never give the Knight a canonical gender, always referring to it with neutral language in every official interview and piece of text. This wasn't necessarily about making a progressive statement. It was a mechanical choice. They wanted the player to be able to project themselves entirely onto the character. The vessels are supposed to be hollow and empty of personality, so giving the Knight a specific gender would have implied a level of identity that the character isn't supposed to have. Fans often get into heated debates about this, but they are missing the point. The Knight is a vessel, a tool, and a blank slate. The one time a developer accidentally used a gendered pronoun in an old interview, they immediately corrected themselves to maintain the mystery. This approach allows every player to see themselves in the protagonist, regardless of who they are. That blankness and silence of the protagonist stands in sharp contrast to the reality of the Pale King, who is much smaller than most players imagine. Because of his godlike importance and the massive scale of his palace, Most people assume the king must be a towering, imposing figure. But when you finally find his remains, you realize he is roughly the same size as the knight. He was a tiny bug with massive, world-altering ideas. The grand architecture of the White Palace was a clever trick to make him seem larger and more powerful through visual association. Team Cherry deliberately made the most powerful figure in history physically unimpressive, subverting the expectation that power must always equal physical size. The fact that the ultimate light, the Radiance, is massive while the king is tiny shows that influence in this world isn't about how much space you take up, but the strength of your will and your vision. Getting that tiny king to look exactly right was a massive struggle that took 7 complete redesigns. Team Cherry went through nearly a dozen different versions of the character before they finally landed on the one we see today. Originally, he looked much more human, then he became more like a traditional insect, and at one point, he was even an abstract, almost mechanical-looking being. The iconic crown, which is now his most recognizable feature, wasn't even added until the 5th version of the design. His height was also a point of contention, with some early sketches making him even smaller than the knight. The final version was only finished a few months before the game's release, which is incredibly late for such a vital character. Most players will never see the piles of discarded concept art, but the king's journey from a rough sketch to a dead god was one of the longest and most difficult creative processes in the entire project. While the appearance of the Pale King underwent a long and exhausting transformation, the metaphysical colors of the world's hidden history shifted just as dramatically behind the scenes. In the final version of the experience, players recognize lifeblood as a distinct, bright blue substance that provides temporary health, often found in cocoons or tucked away grottos. However, in the early draft of the internal mythology, this blue energy wasn't a separate entity at all. Originally, these glowing blue manifestations were intended to be failed experiments involving the Void, conducted by the Pale King in his desperate search for a way to contain the infection. The team initially thought of blue as simply being void energy that had been corrupted, filtered, or altered in a different way through the king's magical research. Eventually, Team Cherry decided to pivot away from this idea because they realized that having every mysterious or supernatural element tied to the void made the world feel a bit too narrow and predictable. They wanted Hallownest to feel like it sat atop layers of even older, more diverse mysteries. By making lifeblood a completely separate, taboo substance with its own obscure origins, they added a new layer of depth to the world's history. This is why lifeblood feels so strange and disconnected from the main narrative path. It was retroactively justified with a new set of rules that had nothing to do with the original logic. The Abyss itself was once supposed to show these two forces, the black void and the blue lifeblood, mixing and swirling together in the deepest pits. Even the character Joni, the kind protector of the lifeblood grotto, was originally envisioned as a researcher who specialized in the study of void mutations. Changing this allowed for a more haunted feel to the blue areas, separating the scientific failure of the king from a more primal, natural mystery. Speaking of things that were planned from the very beginning but took on a life of their own, we have to talk about the sequel that has kept the community in a state of constant anticipation for years. Most people know that the upcoming project follows the journey of Hornet, but few realize that this wasn't originally intended to be a standalone experience. From the very first day of the Kickstarter campaign back in 2014, Hornet was promised as a second playable hero. It was one of the major stretch goals that the community helped reach. The plan was to release her as an expansion, allowing players to revisit the ruins of the Underground Kingdom with a completely different set of acrobatic skills and a different perspective on the story. However, as Team Cherry began to work on her movement and her specific abilities, they ran into a productive problem. Because Hornet is taller, faster, and moves with a much higher degree of agility than the Knight, the existing rooms and corridors of Hallownest simply couldn't contain her. To make her gameplay feel satisfying, They would have had to redesign almost every single area of the game. Rather than trying to cram her into a world that wasn't built for her, the team decided to build an entirely new kingdom that suited her specific playstyle. The project grew so massive so quickly that it transitioned from a simple expansion into a full-blown sequel. So, in a way, the long-awaited sequel is really just Team Cherry finally delivering on a promise made nearly a decade ago. It is a case of creative overflow. Their ideas were simply too big to fit into a small update. Kickstarter backers are eventually going to get this new game for free because technically they already paid for a playable Hornet during the original campaign. When the team finally decided to focus on expanding the first game through digital updates, they brought a very unique philosophy to the way they designed boss fights. The Grim Troop expansion is a fan favorite, largely because of the incredible dance-like battle against the Nightmare King. What is fascinating about this fight is that the team actually designed it entirely in reverse. Usually, a developer might create a basic boss, then make a harder version for a later stage of the game. Team Cherry did the exact opposite. They designed the absolute peak of the challenge, the Nightmare King version, first. They wanted to ensure that the ultimate, most difficult iteration of the fight felt perfectly balanced, musical, and fair. Once they had the perfect version of the battle finished, they worked completely backward to create the regular version of Grim and the various quest steps leading up to him. They essentially simplified the masterpiece to create the introduction. This backwards design philosophy is why the Nightmare King feels so incredibly polished and satisfying to master. He wasn't an afterthought or a buffed version of a regular enemy. He was the foundational idea that the entire expansion was built to support. Even the haunting, Scarlet-themed music was composed for the final encounter first, then stripped down and rearranged for the earlier stages of the ritual. This method is incredibly risky and somewhat chaotic from a software perspective, but it resulted in what many consider to be one of the greatest boss encounters in the history of the genre. While the combat was being meticulously sculpted, the Guardians of the Kingdom, the three Dreamers, underwent a significant visual evolution very late in the cycle. In the earliest versions of the world, Lurien, Monomon, and Hera all shared the exact same mask design. They were essentially three identical, silent figures sitting in different corners of the map. Team Cherry realized that this was a missed opportunity for storytelling and characterization. They wanted each dreamer to reflect the specific culture and atmosphere of the region they protected. The unique masks we see now were designed much later to give each one a distinct personality. Lurien's mask became ornate and aristocratic to fit the City of Tears. Monomon's took on a sleek, scholarly appearance to match her archives, and Hera's mask was given a more primal, many-eyed look to tie her to the spider tribes of the deep. If you look at some of the older internal maps of the kingdom, you can still see the same generic symbol used for all three locations. The shift to unique designs added a layer of visual storytelling that helped the player feel like they were uncovering the specific history of different bug cultures, rather than just checking off three identical boxes. It shows that even small visual changes can significantly enhance the feeling of world building. Not every character in the world was tied to a specific biological origin, however. Some were left mysterious as a very deliberate design choice. The Forged Daughter, who helps you improve your weapon in certain versions of the game, is one of the few characters whose species is never confirmed or even hinted at by the developers. While most NPCs are clearly based on beetles, moths, spiders, or bees, she remains an enigma. Team Cherry purposefully avoided tying her to any real insect biology because they wanted her to feel like she belonged to a forgotten, otherworldly era of the kingdom. They found that leaving some things unexplained actually makes the world feel larger and more mysterious. Ambiguity, in this case, was used as a tool to spark conversation and theory crafting among the community. Not every question in a masterpiece needs a concrete answer. Sometimes the mystery is more valuable than the truth. Speaking of things that players were desperate to see more of, let's discuss the glorified charms that never made it into the game. When the final expansion, Godmaster, was first announced, one of the most exciting features mentioned in the official reveal was the ability to glorify your existing charms. The idea was that as you progress through the boss rush challenges, you would be able to upgrade your favorite abilities to make them even stronger. Imagine a version of the Wayward Compass that not only showed your location, but also revealed the locations of hidden walls nearby. Or perhaps a version of the Gathering Swarm that would actually fly out and attack enemies while it collected your currency. Unfortunately, this entire system was eventually thrown into the trash because the developers realized it was an impossible amount of work to balance correctly. They had dozens of charms in the game, and creating a glorified version for every single one would have required an entirely new set of software instructions and thousands of hours of testing. They admitted later on digital forums that they simply couldn't make it work without delaying the project indefinitely. It remains one of the most famous lost features of the game, a peek into a version of Hallownest where the player's power could have reached even more ridiculous heights. Because the team decided against the glorification system, they had to be much more careful about how they balanced the existing charms. This led to some very difficult decisions during the final months of development. For example, the quick focus charm, which allows the player to heal much faster, was nearly removed from the software entirely. During early testing, the team discovered that this charm was so powerful that it essentially broke the tension of the game. Testers were able to heal in the middle of almost any boss attack, removing the need to find safe openings. Rather than cutting such a beloved ability, Team Cherry decided to tax it heavily. They made it cost 3 whole charm notches, making it one of the most expensive items to equip. Even with that massive cost, it remains a staple of most player builds, proving that the team was right to worry about its power. It is a great example of how developers have to balance fun against challenge, often using high costs to prevent a single ability from dominating the entire experience. A similar struggle occurred with the Grimchild, though in that case, the balance went in the opposite direction. Originally, the Grimchild was envisioned as a powerful, devastating companion that would justify the long and difficult ritual quest. The early versions of the familiar dealt triple the damage it does now and had projectiles that would automatically seek out the weak points of enemies. However, the team found that this made the gameplay itself. Players would just dodge and wait for the baby bug to kill the boss for them. They nerfed the ability so hard that many players now consider it to be one of the most disappointing rewards in the game. The final version was intentionally made to be mediocre to ensure that the player still had to be the primary source of damage. It is a tragic case where a reward for a long quest had to be weakened for the sake of the overall health of the combat system. Other charms, like Quick Slash and Spell Twister, managed to survive the balancing process in a state that many considered to be overpowered. Quick Slash, in particular, was nearly cut because it allowed players to ignore the timing of boss attacks and simply tank through fights by dealing massive damage per second. Combined with other strength-boosting items, it can turn some of the most difficult bosses in the kingdom into absolute jokes. Team Cherry admit that they left it in because removing something that felt so satisfying to use would have angered the community. They chose to let the players have their broken builds rather than enforcing a sterile, perfectly balanced environment. They understood that part of the joy of a deep system is finding ways to feel like you've cheated the difficulty. Perhaps the most famous charm in the entire project, however, is the Wayward Compass. To many new players, this item is an absolute necessity, but to the developers, its existence was originally intended as a joke. Team Cherry thought it was funny that in an era of modern games where players are constantly being led by the hand with GPS markers and mini-maps, they would make the player spend a precious equipment slot just to know where they were on their own map. They expected players to use it for the first hour, learn the layout of the world, and then discard it for something more useful, like a damage boost. Instead, they were shocked to see that the vast majority of players never took it off. The joke backfired in the best way possible. They tried to make fun of hand-holding in games, but accidentally created the most beloved and mandatory item in their entire world. It shows that even when developers try to be subversive, player convenience will usually win in the end. There were also some very specific hidden tributes tucked into the charm designs that only the most observant fans would catch. If you look closely at the Dashmaster charm, it features a very distinctive blue and white design with a head shape that looks remarkably similar to Sans from the game Undertale. This wasn't an accident. It was a quiet tribute to the work of Toby Fox. The team added this because they had a massive amount of respect for other independent creators who were changing the industry. The charms effect, which makes dashing more frequent and efficient, even mirrors Sans's infamous ability to dodge every single attack the player throws at him. It is a rare moment where the world of Hallownest winks at the outside world, showing the interconnected nature of the indie development scene. While the charms provided the depth for the player's build, the Colosseum of Fools provided the ultimate test for those skills. Interestingly, the Colosseum was never actually supposed to be in the final version of the game. It was originally tied to a Kickstarter goal that the campaign didn't quite reach. However, as the team was building out the region known as Kingdom's Edge, they realized the area felt a bit empty and lacked a satisfying anchor for the player to discover. They decided to build the Colosseum anyway, using it as a way to recycle enemy designs and test the player's combat mastery in a controlled environment. William Pellin has even hinted that there is still a massive secret hidden somewhere in the Colosseum that no player has ever officially discovered. Whether this is a true secret or just a bit of playful developer mystery is still debated by the community, but it has led to thousands of hours of people smacking every single wall in the arena looking for a hidden passage. This is the beauty of a project made by such a small team. They could change their plans on a whim and add massive, complex regions simply because they felt the game needed them, regardless of whether the initial funding was there. That same sense of spontaneous creation led to the existence of what the community calls ghost rooms. Because the team was working so quickly and iterating on the world's geography constantly, they often left behind fragments of unfinished rooms in the game's internal software. These are areas that aren't connected to the main map and can only be reached by using external tools to fly through the walls. These rooms often contain strange, floating platforms, forgotten textures, or early versions of enemy logic that were eventually discarded. When fans first started discovering these hidden pockets of digital history, Ari and William were actually surprised. They had completely forgotten that they had even made those areas. It shows how the development process was a bit of a chaotic whirlwind. They were building and destroying parts of the world so fast that they didn't always have time to clean up the scraps left in the internal architecture. These rooms have since become a favorite subject for digital archaeologists who want to see the bones of how Hallownest was built. Even the physical manual contained secrets that would later settle long-standing debates within the community. For years, fans argued about the specific bug species of certain characters, trying to use real-world science to identify them. The manual actually contained subtle hints and sketches that confirmed some of these identities, such as whether a character was meant to be a moth or a butterfly. It is rare for a piece of paper outside of the game to hold so much official weight, but for Team Cherry, every piece of media was an opportunity to expand the world. They used every tool at their disposal to provide depth, from the software logic to the printed page. One of the most touching additions to the game is the Shrine of Believers, a hidden room filled with messages from the original Kickstarter backers. This room is an incredible time capsule of the community that made the game possible. Some of the messages are simple thank you notes, while others contain obscure references to other games like Dark Souls or the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Team Cherry allowed the people who funded their dream to leave their own mark on the kingdom, blending fan culture with the official history of the world. It is a quiet, respectful place that serves as a reminder that this massive, world-altering success only happened because a few thousand people believed in a couple of guys in a cheap office in Adelaide. It turns the financial reality of the project into a permanent, emotional part of the landscape. Once you start looking at the world through the lens of its development, you realize that even the most powerful items in the game carry hidden behavioral secrets. Take the Void Heart Charm, for example. Most players know it is required to reach the true ending, and they understand that it stops the player's own shade from being hostile. However, it actually goes much further than that. This item completely rewrites the aggression logic of every Void creature in the entire kingdom. If you return to the Abyss with the Void Heart equipped, the shadows that once tried to kill you will now simply float past you, acknowledging you as their ruler. This isn't explained in any tutorial or cutscene. It is a change in the creature's internal instructions that the player has to discover for themselves. It is a masterful piece of storytelling through mechanics. By changing how the enemies interact with you, the team communicates your new status as the Lord of Shades far more effectively than any dialogue ever could. It is a subtle, haunting detail that most players might miss, but it adds an incredible amount of weight to the knight's transformation. This practice of recycling and repurposing ideas was a necessity for a team of this size. If you look at the Shade Soul spell, the powerful projectile you unlock in the mid-game, you might notice that it looks a bit similar to the Abyss Shriek. That isn't a coincidence. In the original software architecture, there were going to be several different versions of the Shade Soul, each with a different shape and effect. When the team ran out of time to implement all of these variants, they took the most interesting visual asset and turned it into a completely separate spell. They basically took the scrap art of a discarded projectile and turned it into the foundational art for a legendary scream. This kind of creative recycling is how a team of 3 people managed to make a game that feels like it has the depth of a blockbuster title. They never let a good piece of art go to waste. Sometimes, the developers would leave these happy accidents in the game specifically to help the players. There is a specific room in the Greenpath region where players can farm essence by repeatedly defeating a certain type of bird. This wasn't originally intended. It was a quirk of the respawn logic for that specific creature. When Team Cherry found out about it, they considered fixing the glitch, but then they realized that some players might struggle to collect enough essence through boss fights alone. They decided to leave the exploit in the game as a silent gift to the completionists. They figured that if someone was dedicated enough to stand in a room and farm birds for 3 hours, they deserved the reward. It is a moment of developer mercy, acknowledging that sometimes a bug can actually serve as a helpful feature for the right kind of player. However, not every leftover from development was so helpful. The game is full of digital fossils, tiny mistakes in dialogue or item descriptions that reflect older versions of the world. For instance, the shopkeeper Sly has a line of dialogue where he mentions that a second fragment completes a soul vessel. In the final version of the game, however, it takes 3 fragments to make a whole vessel. The developers changed the requirement from 2 to 3 very late in the cycle to improve the pacing, but they completely forgot to update Sly's dialogue. These inconsistencies are like archaeological layers. They show the history of the game's balance being shifted and tweaked. You can find these little errors all over Hallownest if you look closely enough, moments where the characters are speaking about a version of the world that no longer exists. It adds a strange, unintended layer of mystery to the dialogue, as if the characters themselves are confused about the laws of their own reality. Some of these fossils are even more literal. In the Tower of Love, hidden among the various jars and specimens, there is a small, bottled creature that looks like a beta version of a common enemy. This was a deliberate choice by the artists. They took an early, unused version of a creature design and preserved it in a jar as a background detail. It is a museum piece of the game's own development process, hidden in plain sight for the most observant fans to find. This kind of self-referential humor shows how much fun the team was having, even during the most stressful periods of the project. They were building a world, but they were also building a monument to their own journey as creators. despite all the cute jokes and hidden tributes, Team Cherry was also capable of genuine cruelty when they felt the game required it. The Path of Pain, an optional platforming gauntlet found deep within the White Palace, is widely considered to be one of the most punishing challenges in modern gaming. Ari Gibson has openly admitted that they designed this section as a direct response to players who claimed that the rest of the palace was too easy. He wanted to create something that would push the player's skills and patience to the absolute breaking point. The fact that the reward for this immense struggle is just a brief, silent cutscene was a very deliberate choice. They didn't want to give the player a powerful weapon or a special ability. They wanted the reward to be the lore itself and the sheer satisfaction of having survived. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated challenge, designed by developers who weren't afraid to let their players suffer. The wall that slams shut behind you, preventing you from retreating, was Gibson's final touch to ensure that once you started the Path of Pain, there was no turning back. If you thought the Path of Pain was a singular peak of developer-induced suffering, you should hear about the charm that William Pellin actually wanted to include in the final release, which would have been the ultimate form of digital malice. In several interviews, Pellin mentioned that he seriously considered adding a special Zote-themed charm that would cause the player to die in exactly one hit, regardless of their health or armor. This wasn't just a fleeting joke. It was a concept the team discussed as the ultimate challenge for the most dedicated masochists in the community. They imagined a scenario where players would attempt to navigate the entire kingdom or face off against the absolute toughest bosses while being essentially made of glass. While this glass cannon idea, without the cannon part, eventually stayed on the cutting room floor, its spirit lives on in the Godmaster expansion. The developers realized that the community was so hungry for difficulty that they would willingly impose these kinds of restrictions on themselves anyway. This is why the Eternal Ordeal exists, a secret, endless battle against waves of Zote clones that serves no purpose other than to test how much annoyance a human being can tolerate. This philosophy of pushing the player's limits is a core part of the team's identity. They didn't want to provide a safety net for the player. They wanted every victory to feel earned through sweat and near total exhaustion. The fact that they even considered a one-hit kill charm shows that they viewed the game not just as an adventure, but as a conversation between the designer and the player's resilience. This focus on the player's psychological state is perhaps best evidenced by the very specific, almost mathematical way the team placed the save benches throughout the ruins of the kingdom. If you have ever felt a surge of genuine, heart-pounding anxiety as you wandered through a new area with a massive amount of currency and no idea where the next rest point was, that was entirely by design. Team Cherry didn't just place benches where they felt right for the scenery. They actually studied the rhythm of player stress. They calculated the distance between safe zones to ensure that the tension would build to a specific peak right before the player discovered a new bench. They wanted the discovery of a bench to feel like a literal lifesaver, a moment of profound relief that would release all the built-up cortisol, a long trek through hostile territory. This is why some areas like the deep reaches of the Queen's Gardens or the long climb through the ancient basin feel so much more stressful than others. The walk from the nearest bench to a boss room is often designed to be just long enough to make you dread the idea of dying. They wanted death to have real emotional weight. In many modern titles, you are placed right outside the boss's door the moment you fail, which removes the fear of the journey. In this world, the journey back to the boss is part of the punishment. They engineered the game to make you value your life by making the walk of shame long, lonely, and filled with just enough danger to keep you on edge. The relief you feel when you finally sit down and hear that tired sigh is a carefully calculated psychological reward. That sense of being toyed with extends into the very logic of the final boss encounters as well. If you have ever fought the Radiance and felt like the platforms were disappearing at the exact moment you needed them most, you aren't just having bad luck. The team actually created a specific set of instructions for the arena's behavior that tracks the player's movement patterns. The disappearing platforms in the final phase aren't choosing a random order. The software is often looking at where you are most likely to jump next and removing those options to force you into a state of panic. It is a subtle form of artificial intelligence that isn't just fighting you with attacks, but with the environment itself. They wanted the true final battle of the game to feel as though the very heavens were conspiring against you. By making the ground beneath your feet actively hostile and unpredictable, they elevated the fight from a simple test of reflexes to a test of mental fortitude. Speedrunners have spent countless hours trying to find ways to trick this internal logic, but for the average person, the fight feels like a desperate scramble against an entity that knows exactly where you want to stand. It is a brilliant, if slightly cruel, bit of technical design that ensures the climax of the story feels truly godlike in its scale and unfairness. Not all of the game's cruelty was purely mechanical, though. Some of it was narrative, and some of it was a direct subversion of the expectations of the people who actually funded the project. Take the character of Tiso, for example. Tiso is the cocky, armored warrior you meet at several crossroads who constantly brags about his combat prowess and his impending glory in the Colosseum of Fools. In reality, Tiso was a character created by a high-tier Kickstarter backer named Tiso Spencer. Usually when someone pays thousands of dollars to have a character in a game, they want to be immortalized as a legendary hero or a powerful boss. However, Team Cherry had a different idea. They worked with the backer to create a character that would be the ultimate anti-climax. After hours of hearing Tiso talk about how he is going to crush the competition, you eventually find his broken, pathetic corpse in Kingdom's Edge, having been unceremoniously crushed by a minor boss before he even got to prove himself. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died off-screen, a victim of his own arrogance. The backer apparently loved this idea, finding it hilarious that his contribution to the world was to be the kingdom's biggest loser. It is a perfect example of the team's sense of humor, taking a serious commitment to a fan and turning it into a punchline that reinforces the bleak, unforgiving nature of the world. On the complete opposite end of the emotional spectrum, we have the dream warrior Marmu. While Tiso's story is a dark, Marmu's origin is a heartwarming family affair. Marmu is the round, bouncy caterpillar ghost who just wants to play and learn how to fly. This character was designed by Zara Pellin, the mother of developer William Pellin. She was a backer who was given the chance to contribute a design, and she created something that stands out. It stands out as one of the most wholesome and innocent things in a world otherwise defined by death and decay. There is something deeply charming about the fact that one of the bosses you have to fight was designed by the lead developer's mom. It adds a layer of personal history to the project that you don't find in big-budget corporate productions. Even Marmu's combat style, bouncing around the screen like a joyful ball, reflects that sense of playfulness. However, don't let the cuteness fool you. Marmu can be a surprisingly difficult fight if you don't respect the rhythm of the bounce. It is as if Zara wanted to make sure her son's players still had to work for their victory, even if they were fighting a friendly caterpillar. While Marmu is a joy to encounter, there are other characters whose stories are so quietly tragic that many players actually miss the weight of what that until it is far too late. The Menderbug is perhaps the best example of this. Most players will go through their entire journey without ever seeing him. He has a vanishingly small 2% chance of spawning only if you break the sign at the entrance to the Forgotten Crossroads and then leave and return. He is a tiny, dedicated bug whose only purpose in life is to fix the things the player breaks. He represents the silent, hardworking laborers who keep the world functioning even as it falls apart. If you happen to catch him and kill him, which happens in an instant because he has almost no health, you can then visit his house near the bottom of the map. Inside, you find his diary, which reveals a life of profound loneliness and simple, honest goals. He didn't have any grand ambitions or magical powers. He just wanted to be useful and hoped that the mysterious stranger, the player, would keep breaking signs so he would have something to do. Finding that diary after accidentally killing him is one of the most guilt-inducing moments in the entire experience. Team Cherry created a character that you can only meet by being destructive, and whose death serves as a stinging rebuke to the player's kill everything instincts. It is a masterpiece of missable, emotional storytelling. This theme of consequences and hidden paths is also central to the story of Cloth, the brave but fearful cicada warrior. Many players believe that Cloth's heroic death during the battle with the Traitor Lord is a mandatory part of the story, but it is actually a result of the player's specific choices. If you never rescue her in the ancient basin or never speak to her in the various locations where she hides, she will never show up to help you in that final fight. In that version of the timeline, she actually survives the events of the game and eventually leaves the kingdom to find adventures elsewhere. However, by saving her and encouraging her to be brave, you are actually leading her toward her final, fatal confrontation. It creates a fascinating moral dilemma. Is it better for her to live a long life of fear and obscurity, or to die a hero's death, having finally found her courage? Team Cherry doesn't give you an answer. They just let the systems of the game play out. Most players who want to complete every quest will inevitably cause her death, proving that in Hallownest, being a completionist often leads to the most tragic outcomes for the people you meet. The sense of a world that is unfinished or missing its heart is nowhere more apparent than in the story of the last stag. Throughout the game, the stag serves as your primary means of fast travel, a weary but loyal servant of a dead civilization. As you find more stag stations, he begins to recover his memories, eventually leading you to the stag nest. Originally, the team had planned for a much more elaborate and emotional conclusion to this quest. There were plans for a full cutscene where the stag would find a clutch of eggs that were actually hatching, revealing that his race was not as extinct as he believed. You would have seen tiny baby stags crawling out of the shells and calling him grandfather. It would have been the ultimate moment of hope in a very dark story. However, due to the ever-present constraints of time and budget, this scene was cut down to a single, easily missed line of dialogue and an empty eggshell. While the revelation that the stags might survive is still there, it lacks the cinematic punch that the team originally intended. It is one of those moments where the player has to use their imagination to fill in the gaps left by the realities of independent development. The stag's quest feels slightly hollow because, in a very literal sense, the heart of the ending was removed to save on animation time. This trimming of emotional arcs also affected the relationship between the mapmaker Cornifer and his wife Iselda. In the final version of the game, they are a charming couple who run the shop in Dirtmouth, but their history and their dynamic were originally intended to be much more complex. The team had written an entire series of quest steps that would have explored how they met and why Iselda, a former warrior, chose to hang up her sword and settle in a dying town. There was going to be a subplot where the player helped them reconcile their different views on life. Cornifer is obsessed with exploration and the thrill of the unknown, while Iselda craves stability and safety. You would have seen them argue and eventually come to an understanding. Most of this was cut for pacing reasons, leaving us with only small hints of their past in their dream-nail dialogue. This is why Iselda often sounds a bit bored or frustrated when you talk to her. She is a character who had her entire backstory removed, leaving only the residue of a life she no longer leads. They are still the most stable couple in the kingdom, but they were almost the most deeply developed characters in the entire script. The developers also had to rein themselves in when it came to the character of Bretta. When you first save Bretta from the fungal wastes, she seems like a simple, sweet character who develops a bit of a crush on the knight. However, the original version of her story was significantly more disturbing. The team had written her as a genuine stalker, with her diary entries containing increasingly unsettling details about her following the knight through the darkness. There were even plans for her to appear in the background of certain areas, watching the player from the shadows before scurrying away when spotted. During the testing phase, the team realized that this was making the players feel genuinely uncomfortable in a way that didn't fit the heroic tone they wanted for the knight. They decided to tone down the stalking and instead pivoted her obsession toward the character of Zode. This was a brilliant move, as it turned a creepy storyline into a hilarious one. By having her fall in love with the kingdom's biggest fraud, they created a perfect satire of hero worship. The creepy basement shrine she builds is still there, but now it is a tribute to the mighty, Zote the Mighty, making it a joke rather than a threat. It is a great example of how developer course correction can take a dark, potentially off-putting idea and turn it into one of the most memorable comedic subplots in the game. Another character who underwent a massive personality flip during development was Salubra, the charm seller. If you look at her character design, she's quite large, purple, and has a very wide, toothy grin that can feel a bit too much in the quiet atmosphere of the crossroads. This is because she was originally designed as one of the game's primary villains. In the early draft of the script, her obsession with charms was a dark, predatory thing. She wasn't selling them to help you. She was using them to mark the player, slowly draining their soul to feed her own power. The Salubra's blessing that you receive after collecting all the charms was originally going to be a curse that would activate during the final boss fight, making the knight weaker at the most crucial moment. Team Cherry eventually decided that the game was already depressing enough, and that having a friendly shopkeeper turn into a monster was a trope they didn't need to lean on. They kept her design exactly as it was, but rewrote her personality to be bubbly, affectionate, and slightly overbearing. This is why there is such a strange mismatch between her scary appearance and her sweet behavior. She is a villain who was forced to be a saint at the last second. That sense of narrative justice also found its way into the fate of Leg Eater, the greedy scavenger who sells you fragile charms. If you follow the Grim Troop questline to its conclusion, you will eventually see Leg Eater meet a gruesome end when he is literally consumed by the mysterious divine. While this might seem like a random bit of gross-out horror, the team viewed it as a very specific form of karma. Leg Eater is one of the few characters in the game who is explicitly stated to be predatory and exploitative, preying on other bugs and even eating his own customers when they can't pay. By having him be eaten by someone even more divine and powerful than himself, the developers were delivering a final judgment on his greed. The fact that Divine then takes his fragile charms and makes them unbreakable is a sign that the cycle of exploitation has ended. It is a very dark way of saying that in a dying world, those who live by the eat or be eaten rule will eventually find themselves on the wrong side of the equation. Team Cherry hid this bit of moral storytelling behind a high-cost upgrade mechanic that many players never even finish, showing that they were willing to put deep thematic work into even the most obscure corners of the game. Contrast this with Relic Seeker Lem, who is perhaps the most grounded person in the entire story. Lem is a historian, a man entirely obsessed with the past and the value of ancient trinkets. The developers have said that they intentionally made Lem the most stable and normal character in the kingdom to serve as a baseline for the player. While everyone else is going mad, becoming infected, or seeking to become gods, Lem is just sitting in his shop, cleaning old journals and complaining about the quality of the artifacts you bring him. He doesn't have a tragic secret or a hidden agenda. He just wants to preserve history. He provides a sense of continuity, a reminder that the world of Hallownest was once a place of learning and culture, not just a series of rooms filled with monsters. The fact that he is so unbothered by the impending apocalypse makes him a strangely comforting presence. He represents the idea that even when the world is ending, someone will be there to take notes and make sure the story survives. He is the quiet anchor of the narrative. As the team worked to fill in these narrative gaps, they often had to wrestle with the ghosts of their more ambitious technical ideas. We've mentioned the water temple-style regions that were cut, but the remnants of those ideas are still visible if you know where to look. Those creepy, long-reaching void tendrils in the abyss were originally meant to be much more than just simple obstacles. In the original software framework, those were intended to be fully interactive enemies with health bars and complex AI patterns. You were supposed to fight them while swimming through a vast, lightless sea, with the tendrils being just the fingers of a much larger, unseen horror lurking in the background. When the team had to cut the swimming mechanics and the water physics to save time, they didn't want to throw away the work they had done on the tendrils. They simplified the logic so the tendrils became environmental hazards that simply swiped at the player. It is a fascinating look at how a massive, epic boss concept can be reduced to a simple spikes mechanic when the budget runs out. Those tendrils are the fossilized remains of what was supposed to be the most terrifying combat encounter in the entire abyss. This process of merging and simplifying also explains why the boss Nosk feels a bit confused in its execution. Nosk is the creature in Deepnest that mimics the knight's appearance to lure it into a trap. Originally, Nosk was planned to be two completely separate encounters. One was the mimic fight, which would have involved a long, psychological game of cat and mouse where the creature would appear as friendly NPCs to trick the player. The second was a straightforward giant spider boss found deep in the tunnels. Because the team was running out of development space in the Deepnest region, they decided to smash these two ideas together. This is why the mimic aspect of Nosk feels so brief. It only happens for a few seconds before the fight starts. The psychological horror of the creature pretending to be your friend was largely lost in favor of a traditional boss battle. Many players feel that Nosk's potential was slightly wasted, and they are right. He is a hybrid of two great ideas that didn't have enough room to breathe on their own. Even the Collector, the lanky, four-armed shadow who hoards grubs in jars, has a history rooted in the team's own personal fears. The design of the Collector, with its unsettling rubbery movement and its constant manic laughter, was pulled directly from a nightmare that one of the team members had during the early years of development. In the dream, they were being chased through a series of glass-filled rooms by a figure that wasn't trying to kill them, but was trying to preserve them in a jar. They found the idea of being collected far more terrifying than the idea of being killed, and they immediately set to work translating that nightmare logic into a boss fight. This is why the Collector's movements don't follow the same biological rules as the other bugs. He moves like a distorted fever dream entity. The jars that fall from the ceiling are a direct reference to that original dream. It is a rare case where a developer's actual night terrors became a permanent part of the player's experience, proving that the most unsettling things in art often come from the deepest parts of our own subconscious. One of the most touching environmental stories in the game is found in the hidden room belonging to the Dung Defender. If you explore behind a certain wall, you can find a secret chamber filled with small statues made of, well, dung. These statues represent the 5 great knights who once protected the kingdom alongside him. While it might seem like a gross-out joke at first, it is actually a deeply emotional moment. The Dung Defender is the only one of the knights left who still believes in the honor of the kingdom. He has spent centuries in isolation, crafting these memorials out of the only material he has available just to make sure his friends aren't forgotten. He is a character defined by a level of loyalty and devotion that is almost heartbreaking. Team Cheria said that they wanted to show that even in the most disgusting or lowly circumstances, true nobility and friendship can survive. The statues are a monument to a brotherhood that has been dead for ages, maintained by a single, lonely survivor who refuses to let the flame of the past go out. This focus on the quiet, emotional weight of the world culminates in the way the team handled the death of the Pale King and the final boss of the Hollow story. When you finally reach the king's throne, you can knock his corpse off with a single hit. The team spent a massive amount of time getting the physics of that fall exactly right. They wanted the body to fall with a sense of hollow lightness, showing that for all his power, the king was ultimately just a shell. They specifically removed any music or dramatic sound effects from this moment, leaving only the sound of the body hitting the floor. They felt that silence was far more powerful than any orchestral swell. The same logic was applied to the Hollow Knight boss fight itself. If you look at the internal files, there is actually recorded dialogue for the Hollow Knight where it would have pleaded with the player, saying things like, "Father," or "Kill me," during the battle. They decided to cut these lines at the very last second because they felt that the character's silent, agonizing struggle, where it begins to stab itself with its own nail, communicated the tragedy far more effectively than words ever could. They chose to let the player's own empathy do the work, proving that sometimes the best storytelling is the kind that refuses to speak. Finally, we have to mention one of the most disturbing cut ideas that almost made it into the game's deepest reaches. In the Abyss, the team had originally planned to include a bench made entirely out of the corpses of failed vessels, your own siblings. You would have literally rested and saved your progress by sitting on a pile of your dead family members. They even went as far as creating the artwork for this corpse bench before they realized it might be just a bit too dark, even for their standards. They decided to replace it with the traditional metal benches to avoid making the player feel like a total monster. However, it shows just how far the team was willing to go to emphasize the horror of the king's plan. The fact that they almost made furniture out of dead children is a reminder that Hallownest, for all its beauty, is built on a foundation of absolute unmitigated horror. It is a world where even a moment of rest was almost a reminder of a genocide. While the developers were busy crafting the narrative and the artistic soul of the kingdom, the community was discovering that the very hardware and software systems running the game could be bent and broken in ways that change the experience entirely. For example, if you have ever tried to tackle the game's toughest challenges on a modern, high-end PC, you might have inadvertently stumbled into a secret easy mode without even realizing it. It has been discovered that playing the game at 120 frames per second, or even higher, makes the entire experience noticeably easier to manage. This isn't just about the visuals looking smoother or the animations appearing more fluid, it actually changes the fundamental feel of the controls. At higher frame rates, the knight becomes significantly more responsive to your inputs. The window of time between you pushing a button and the character reacting on the screen shrinks, making those frame-perfect dodges and rapid-fire nail strikes feel almost effortless. Players who had spent dozens of hours struggling with the late-game bosses on a standard 60-frame setup often found that when they upgraded their hardware, everything clicked into place. It wasn't necessarily that their personal skill had leveled up overnight, but rather that their monitor and graphics card were doing the heavy lifting. Team Cherry never actually designed the game to be played at these high refresh rates. They built it for the standard consoles and basic monitors of the time. This means that for the dedicated community, high-end hardware became an unintentional tool for overcoming the game's brutal difficulty. It is a fascinating case where the technology used to play the game effectively became a hidden difficulty slider, rewarding those with the best equipment with a more giving reaction window. This relationship between the player's technical setup and the game's difficulty is something that the speedrunning community has mastered and exploited to a degree that would make the average player's head spin. While the casual player is worried about surviving a single boss fight, speedrunners are looking at the very logic of the software to find seconds they can shave off their time. One of the most interesting secrets they discovered involves the way the game tracks time. In many titles, the timer is a relentless, ever-ticking force, but in this world, the pause button is a magical sanctuary. The in-game timer actually stops completely whenever you pause the game. This means that a player could be in the middle of a grueling 5-hour speedrun achievement attempt, pause the game, go out to grab a pizza, watch a feature-length movie, and then come back to find that the timer hasn't moved a single second. This discovery was a massive revelation for achievement hunters who felt the pressure of the clock. It allowed them to take a breath, consult a map, or simply rest their hands without any penalty. Team Cherry likely included this feature to be fair to normal human beings who might have interruptions in their lives, but for the competitive scene, it was a tool to be used and managed. It created a strange contrast. On the screen, the knight is moving with frantic, superhuman speed, but in reality, the player might be taking a very long, very relaxed break. However, the most elite speedrunners don't just rely on pausing the game. They find ways to break the very laws of physics within the ruins of Hallownest. A legendary runner known as Scruffy became famous for discovering a technique that essentially broke the game's movement logic wide open. He found a way to store the state of a wall cling even when the knight wasn't touching a wall. By manipulating the software's input buffers during a specific frame of a certain attack, players could trick the game into thinking they were maintaining their momentum from a dash across an entire room. This technique, known as wall cling storage, transformed the knight from a small, nimble bug into a literal rocket. You could fly through entire sections of the map, skipping platforming puzzles and bypassing enemies in a matter of seconds. It required mashing buttons with incredible precision while canceling specific animations. But once mastered, it dropped world record times by several minutes. When the developers saw this, they didn't rush to patch it out. They found it fascinating and impressive. They decided that if someone was talented and dedicated enough to find and exploit these holes in the software logic, they deserved to use them. It became a shared joke between the team and the fans. The best features in the game weren't always the ones that were supposed to exist. This same philosophy of letting the players lead is actually how the game's famous hardcore permadeath mode, Steel Soul, came into existence. Many people assume this was a carefully planned feature intended to increase the game's longevity, but it was actually a bit of a last-minute accident. During the testing phase, the developers noticed that a segment of the audience was already playing the game this way, deleting their entire save file the moment they died, just to see if they could beat the whole thing in one life. The team looked at this behavior and realized it would be incredibly easy to implement as an official mode. The logic behind Steel Soul is hilariously simple. The software essentially just checks the death variable, and if it is true, it triggers a delete file command. There is no complex hidden programming or deep mechanical shifts. It is just a digital execution of a player's failure. To make the mode feel a bit more official, they added the character Steel Soul Jin, who replaces the normal merchant to provide a unique service for those brave enough to play without a safety net. But at its heart, one of the most respected and feared modes in the genre exists simply because the developers saw their testers being masochists and decided to make it official. If Steel Soul represents the peak of player discipline, then the Grey Prince Zot encounters represent the peak of developer trolling. Team Cherry has an undeniably mischievous side, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the way they handled the mighty Zote. After you defeat his dream version for the first time, the game allows you to fight him again, and again, and again, and again. In fact, you can fight him 10 different times, and each time he becomes significantly more powerful, gaining more health and dealing more damage. There is absolutely no narrative reason to do this, and the gameplay reward is almost non-existent. The developers added these 10 difficulty levels specifically to mess with the heads of completionist players. They knew that people who wanted that 100% status would feel compelled to beat him every single time, even as the fight became an exercise in pure frustration. The reward for beating the final most difficult version is just a golden statue in a basement. It is a brilliant bit of satire on the nature of grinding in video games. They created a challenge that was intentionally tedious and unrewarding just to see if the players would do it. And of course, they did. This sense of the absurd also led to the creation of the Eternal Ordeal, a secret mode found within the Godhome expansion. To win this mode and unlock a new menu theme, the player must defeat exactly 57 copies of Zote. When fans asked about the significance of the number 57, looking for deep lore connections or hidden mathematical patterns, the developers admitted that they just picked the number at random because it felt long enough to be annoying, but short enough to be possible. There is no secret meaning. It is just a random number chosen to facilitate a joke. This is a recurring theme in the history of the project. The fans searching for profound meaning in things that the developers did on a whim because they thought it would be funny. Zote, in all his forms, is a monument to the fact that not everything in a masterpiece has to be serious. Sometimes, a bug with a wooden sword is just there to waste your time and make you laugh. That same arbitrary approach to numbers is why the game's final completion percentage is 112%. To a mathematician or a logical designer, This is a nightmare, but to Team Cherry, it was a practical solution. As they kept adding free expansions like the Grim Troop and Godmaster, they didn't want to take away the 100% status that players had already earned. Their solution was to simply keep adding percentages on top of the original number. They once joked that if they kept making updates, the percentage might eventually reach 200% or higher. It is a completely meaningless number that has become an iconic part of the game's legacy. It represents the overflow of creativity that defined the project, a game that simply refused to stop growing, even when it broke the basic rules of mathematics. This growth wasn't always smooth, however. Sometimes the expansion of the game's world ran into the cold, hard reality of legal trademark systems. The final expansion, which we all know as Godmaster, was originally supposed to be called Gods and Glory. The team had already announced the name, created the marketing materials, and built the hype. But just weeks before the launch, they were contacted by lawyers representing another company that owned a trademark on that specific phrase. To avoid a long and expensive legal battle that could have bankrupted the small studio, they had to scramble to change the name at the very last second. Godmaster was the compromise they reached, and while many fans still think the original name sounded more epic, the change was a harsh reminder of the business side of the industry. Even when you are a small team in Adelaide making art about bugs, you still have to navigate the world of international corporate law. Similarly, the Void Heart edition that appeared on PlayStation and Xbox consoles was more about marketing than new content. Many players were confused, thinking this was a director's cut with hidden features or secret lore. In reality, it was just the base game with all the previous free updates bundled together, so it would look like a fresh release on those platforms. The name Void Heart was chosen because it sounded cool and mysterious, not because it added anything new to the software. It worked perfectly, drawing in a whole new audience of console players who felt they were getting the definitive experience. But it remains a funny example of how branding can create a sense of mystery where there is actually just good business sense. However, the team did use their late-game updates to fix one of their biggest regrets, the emptiness of the Abyss. As we've mentioned, the Abyss was originally supposed to be much larger, but it launched in a relatively hollow state. Over a year after the game's initial release, the team added the birthplace cutscene in the Lifeblood update. This wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a fundamental piece of the story that had been missing since day one. Before this update, players had to guess most of the knight's origins based on vague environmental clues. By adding this cinematic moment for free, the team finally completed the emotional arc they had envisioned years earlier. It is rare for a developer to be able to patch in the emotional core of their story a year after everyone has already finished it. But for Team Cherry, it was a way of apologizing for the content they had been forced to cut during the original crunch. It turned the Abyss from a disappointing puddle into the most hauntingly important location in the entire world. The scale of the work they were doing in those final weeks of development is truly staggering. The Hall of Gods, the massive room where you can fight every boss in the game on increased difficulty, was built in a single week of intense, around-the-clock labor. Originally, the Godmaster expansion was just going to have a simple, boring menu where you could select a boss and fight them. But Ari and William felt that a menu screen didn't fit the vibe of Hallownest. They wanted a physical place where these gods were worshipped. So in a massive burst of creative energy, they drew the statues, designed the atmospheric lighting, and built the entire location just days before the expansion was due to launch. This is why the Hall of Gods feels so special. It wasn't a calculated feature planned months in advance, but a desperate, last-minute attempt to make a gameplay mechanic feel like a part of a living world. Every statue's pose was chosen to reflect the personality of the boss, a level of detail that seems impossible given the time frame they were working within. This same last-minute energy led to the creation of the Godseeker character. In the early drafts of the expansion, you simply access the boss rushes through an old, silent sarcophagus, but the team felt the expansion lacked a face, a character to explain why the player was doing all this. They designed the Godseeker, wrote her thousands of words of arrogant, high-minded dialogue, and integrated her into the world in about 7 days. She feels a bit disconnected from the rest of the kingdom's lore because, technically, she is. She was an 11th hour addition designed to give the gameplay a narrative hook. Despite her rushed origins, she has become one of the most memorable and divisive characters in the game, a testament to the team's ability to create compelling personalities under extreme pressure. Even the way the world reacts to the player's progress was a subject of intense technical and emotional planning. The moment the Forgotten Crossroads becomes the Infected Crossroads is one of the most jarring and effective turning points in the game. This transformation isn't tied to how many hours you've played. It is triggered by very specific milestones in the software logic, usually when you kill the broken vessel or obtain the Monarch wings. Team Cherry wanted to violate the unwritten rule of gaming that starter areas should remain safe and unchanging. They wanted to show that the player's quest for power was actually making the world worse, forcing the infection to spread in response to your actions. This creates a powerful feeling of guilt and urgency. The fact that the bugs you use to easily dodge are now exploding with Orange Plague is a visceral reminder of the stakes. For the speedrunning community, this meant they had to find ways to navigate the world without ever triggering those specific flags, allowing them to keep the crossroads clean for as long as possible. It is a brilliant example of how a narrative event can be translated into a mechanical shift that changes the player's entire relationship with the map. Behind all of these visible changes, the developers were also constantly performing what they called minor map fixes. If you look at the patch notes from the years following the release, you will see this phrase repeated dozens of times. To the average player, it sounds like boring technical cleanup. But for the team, it was an obsession. They were constantly tweaking the collision boxes of walls, slightly adjusting the placement of platforms, and ensuring that every single room lined up perfectly with its neighbors on the world map. They wanted the exploration to feel seamless, a perfect flow of movement where the player never felt like they were fighting the geography. This quiet perfectionism is why the game feels so polished despite being made by such a small group. They never stopped looking for ways to make the experience 1% better, even years after most of their audience had moved on. It shows that they viewed the kingdom not as a product to be sold, but as a masterpiece to be maintained and perfected. This attention to detail extended to the very colors and effects of the knight's abilities, sometimes leading to heated internal debates. One of the most controversial choices within the studio was the specific shade of purple used for the Shade Cloak dash. Originally, Ari Gibson wanted the dash to be a pure, inky black to match the theme of the Void. However, during testing, the team discovered that a black dash was almost impossible to see against the dark, moody backgrounds of the late-game areas. Players couldn't tell if their invincibility frames were active, leading to constant, frustrating deaths. They tried making the effect white, but that looked too much like the regular dash. The purple glow we see now was the compromise they reached to ensure gameplay clarity. Some of the artists still feel that the purple looks a bit out of place in the world's color palette, but the designers insisted that the player's ability to read the screen was more important than pure aesthetic consistency. It is a classic example of the tension between art and gameplay. A battle where the player's survival almost always has to come first. Even the names of the weapons were chosen to reflect this blend of high lore and deep character irony. Zoti's weapon is called Life Ender, a name that sounds like it belongs to a legendary god-slaying blade. But if you look at the internal descriptions, the nail is made of shellwood, essentially a piece of painted driftwood. It has no edge and can't actually hurt anything. There is a deep lore implication here. In this world, words have a tangible power. The Pale King used words to grant consciousness to insects, and Zode is trying to use that same magic by naming his pathetic stick something terrifying, hoping that the name itself will make it deadly. It is a beautiful piece of character building through an item description. It tells you everything you need to know about Zode's delusional nature. He believes that if he just says something loud enough and with enough confidence, reality will bend to his will. The fact that his nail deals exactly 0 damage is the ultimate punchline to his entire existence. This self-referential humor goes even deeper with the character of Mr. Mushroom. This strange, floating entity travels throughout the kingdom, and if you have the right equipment to understand him, he says something truly fascinating. He mentions that it is good you were able to help your friends, so you are no longer hungry. This is a direct meta reference to Hungry Night, the original failed game jam project that started the whole journey. In that 2013 game, the protagonist was a creature that had to constantly eat to stay alive. By having Mr. Mushroom mention this, Team Cherry was essentially making their first trash idea a canonical part of the Knight's history. It implies that the Knight existed in a different form before arriving in Hallownest, a small Easter egg for the few fans who had followed the team since their Newgrounds days. It is a way of honoring their own humble beginnings, showing that even a masterpiece is built on the bones of a failure. Even the game's opening poem, Elegy for Hallownest, has a hidden history. The version we see in the final game is brief, haunting, and mysterious, but the original draft was nearly 3 times as long, containing much more explicit information about the king's pact with the higher beings and the nature of the plague. During the trimming phase, the developers realized that giving the player too many answers right at the start ruined the sense of discovery. They cut the poem down to its most vague and poetic elements, forcing the player to work for their understanding of the world. Somewhere in the team's archives, there is a version of that poem that probably explains every single lore mystery the fans have been debating for years, but they chose to keep it hidden, believing that a mystery is always more engaging than a textbook. This respect for the player's intelligence is a hallmark of their design. They would rather you be confused and curious than bored and over-informed. This same philosophy of show, don't tell guided the creation of the Dream Warriors. As we've mentioned, Gorb was the first one they designed, and his bizarre, great mind personality set the standard for the rest. They wanted these ghosts to feel like people who had been driven a bit mad by their own legend. But because the team was so small, they had to simplify the mechanics of these fights. Originally, the Dream Warriors were supposed to be able to respawn, allowing the player to fight them multiple times to farm essence. They eventually cut this because they realized it made the essence requirement for the Dream Nail trivial. They wanted every bit of essence to feel like it was carved out of a difficult victory. If you could just fight Gorb over and over again, the awoken version of the nail wouldn't feel like a legendary achievement. They chose to protect the weight of the game's progression over the convenience of repeatable content. It is another example of them choosing the difficult path to ensure the final product felt meaningful. This sense of protecting the experience even extended to how they punished the player for their greed. The character of Millabelle the Banker is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The developers knew that players would be desperate for a place to store their currency, especially given how easy it is to lose everything upon death. They created Millabelle to look as sweet and trustworthy as possible, specifically to lure players into a false sense of security. They thought it was hilarious that in a world defined by decay and betrayal, people would still trust a banker just because she had a nice voice and a warm shop. The moment she disappears with all your money is intended to be a lesson. In Hallownest, there are no safety nets. The fact that you can later find her in a hot spring and smack your money back out of her is the comedic payoff, but the initial sting of the betrayal was a deliberate attempt to make the player feel the hollow nature of the world. They wanted you to feel like a fool for ever thinking someone would look out for you. And yet, for all their trolling and cruelty, the team also included moments of profound, unexpected mercy. The delicate flower quest is arguably the most stressful task in the game, requiring you to carry a fragile item across the entire map without taking a single hit or using fast travel. If you fail, the flower breaks and you have to go all the way back to the start. However, if you complete the quest, or if certain conditions are met, the grave of the Grey Mourner begins to produce infinite flowers. Team Cherry didn't have to do this. They could have made the flowers a finite resource, making the quest even more punishing. But they realized that at a certain point, pure frustration stops being fun. The infinite flowers are their way of saying, we know this is hard, so we'll give you as many tries as you need. It is a rare moment where the developers stepped in to provide a bit of a mercy system, acknowledging that they might have gone a bit too far with the difficulty of that specific mission. This same balance of mystery and future planning can be found in the dialogue of the Moss Prophet. This strange, infected creature speaks in riddles about the return of the light. But if you listen closely, his words don't quite fit the story of Hallownest. The developers have hinted that some of his dialogue was actually setting up the themes of Silksong years before they even knew they were making a sequel. He speaks of things that happen in other lands, planting seeds of a larger universe that they were only just beginning to imagine. It shows that even while they were struggling to finish the first game, their minds were already drifting toward what came next. They weren't just building a kingdom, they were building a franchise, even if they were doing it from a tiny, cheap office in Adelaide with no guarantee that anyone would even play their work. Finally, we have to talk about the strange, unintended legacy of the game's sound design. In the Crystal Peak region, the enemies use high-pitched, resonant sound effects that mimic the singing of crystals. It was discovered after launch that these specific sound frequencies were actually causing physical damage to the speakers on certain cheap television sets and low-end monitors. The sounds were so sharp and had such a specific resonance that they caused the hardware to vibrate in ways it wasn't designed for. When Team Cherry found out about this, their reaction was a blend of shock and amusement. They didn't intend to break people's hardware, but they felt it was thematically appropriate that the crystals of the peak were so intense they could literally shatter things in the real world. They didn't end up patching the sounds because they felt it added to the dangerous atmosphere of the area. It is a perfect microcosm of the entire project, a small, scrappy team making something so intense and so uncompromising that it literally vibrated the world around it. The sonic landscape of the kingdom is a place of incredible contrast, where the most unsettling visceral noises and the most elegant melodic battle cries often originate from the exact same human source. This is perhaps most famously illustrated in the character of Makoto Koji, a close friend of the development team who stepped into the recording booth and provided a vocal range that is nothing short of breathtaking. Most players recognize her as the voice of Hornet, the sharp, graceful protector of Hallownest, whose Shaw and Adino cries have become iconic symbols of skill and resolve. Koji's performance as Hornet perfectly captures the character's noble, albeit tragic, warrior spirit. However, that same person is also responsible for the bone-chilling, wet, and rhythmic screeches of the Flukmarm, the massive, pulsating mound of flesh found in the depths of the royal waterways. The transition from a poised princess to a nightmarish blob of biological horror happened in the same recording session, a feat of vocal flexibility that the developers still talk about with a mixture of awe and amusement. The recording process for the Flukmarm was apparently a highlight of the project's audio development, characterized by long stretches of uncontrollable laughter as Koji experimented with the most disgusting and absurd noises she could produce. To create the final, haunting effect of the Flesh Mother, the team took several of her most unsettling takes and layered them on top of one another, creating a sound that feels like it's coming from multiple throats at once. This isn't just a fun piece of trivia, it's a testament to the DIY spirit that defined the entire project. When you don't have a massive budget for a roster of professional voice talent, you rely on the incredible talent of your friends, pushing them to explore the extremes of their vocal abilities. Knowing that the same person who gives you a sense of epic rivalry also provides the sounds of your most skin-crawling nightmares adds a hidden layer of artistic depth to the world's atmosphere. Behind every beautifully hand-drawn frame and every haunting melody, there was a massive mountain of technical logic that had to function perfectly for the game to succeed. While Ari and William are the names most often associated with the creative vision, The technical foundation of the game was largely the work of David Kazi. He was the technical director who took the wild, often physically impossible ideas dreamed up by the artists and translated them into a functioning digital reality. He was the person who built the internal framework that allowed the knight to move with such precision and ensured that the world's complex layers of art didn't crash the player's machine. Kazi's role was legendary within the small Adelaide office, as he was often the voice of reason when the creative leads wanted to add features that would have broken the software's stability. However, in 2017, shortly after the game's massive success began to take hold, Kazi decided to leave Team Cherry to pursue a career in a more stable corporate environment. His departure was a significant turning point for the studio and is a primary reason why the development of subsequent projects has taken as long as it has. When you have such a tiny team, the loss of even one person is like losing a limb. Finding someone who could not only match Kazi's deep understanding of the project's internal logic, but also tolerate the chaotic, iterative nature of Team Cherry's creative process was an immense challenge. His work on the original game remains the bedrock upon which everything else was built, a silent reminder that even the most poetic and artistic games are ultimately held together by the genius of a great programmer. This technical complexity leads us to one of the most persistent and frustrating mysteries in the community, the switch tax on reaction time. Since the game's celebrated launch on the Nintendo Switch in 2018, a significant portion of the player base has complained about a subtle but noticeable delay in the controls. On a powerful PC, the knight feels like an extension of the player's own nervous system, reacting the very instant a button is pressed. But on the Switch, many veterans of the game swear that there is a microscopic lag, a brief moment of hesitation that can make the difference between a successful parry and a devastating hit. The team at Team Cherry has consistently maintained that there is no technical reason for this delay, yet the speedrunning community almost entirely avoids the Switch version for high-level play. They find that the timing required for frame-perfect maneuvers is simply too unreliable on the portable console. Whether this is a result of the hardware's internal processing, the way the screen handles refresh rates, or a quirk of the software's translation to the handheld system remains a subject of intense debate. It has created a strange situation where there are essentially two different difficulty levels for the game: the snappy PC version and the heavy Switch version. For players who have only ever experienced the game on Nintendo's hardware, the brutal difficulty of bosses like the Pure Vessel or Absolute Radiance might be even more impressive than they realize, as they are fighting not just the boss, but a phantom delay in their own hands. The fact that this masterpiece exists at all is a miracle of geographic economics. As we have discussed, the team's ability to survive for years on a very small amount of money was largely due to their location in Adelaide. In the grand scheme of Australian geography, Adelaide is often overlooked in favor of the glittering skylines of Sydney or the cultural hub of Melbourne. But for a scrappy indie team, Adelaide was the perfect sanctuary. It is a city where life moves a bit slower and, crucially, where the rent is significantly lower than in the major metropolitan centers. The developers worked in an office that was so cramped they could practically hear each other thinking, a small room that became a pressure cooker for creative ideas. They didn't have the distractions of a massive, bustling tech scene, and they weren't being crushed by the financial stress of living in an expensive global city. This isolation and affordability allowed them to stay in development mode far longer than most studios could ever afford. They were able to obsess over the curve of a single cavern wall or the timing of a single jump because they weren't constantly staring at an empty bank account. The quiet, somewhat lonely atmosphere of Adelaide itself seemed to bleed into the game's tone, influencing the sense of solitude and melancholy that defines the experience. In many ways, Hallownest is a reflection of the environment in which it was born. A hidden, quiet world that operates by its own rules, far away from the noise of the surface. This unique, creative environment eventually birthed the idea for a sequel, though the way that project started was almost as strange as the origins of the first game. The upcoming sequel, focusing on the journey of Hornet, actually began its life as an April Fool's Day prank. The team had been discussing the idea of a playable Hornet for years, as it was one of their original Kickstarter promises. But the specific vision for a full-fledged sequel started as a joke they wanted to play on their fans. They created a series of high-quality fake screenshots and teased a massive new world just to see how the community would react. The response was so overwhelmingly positive, and the team found themselves so inspired by the new mechanics they were dreaming up that the prank quickly turned into a serious commitment. They realized that the ideas they had for Hornet's agility and her more aggressive combat style were too big to be contained in a simple piece of downloadable content. The 2014 promise of a second playable hero evolved into a standalone epic, a project that has now consumed more of the team's time than the original game itself. It is a testament to the way Team Cherry works. They follow the fun and the excitement of an idea, even if it starts as a bit of developer humor. What began as a way to mess with their fans' expectations became the most anticipated follow-up in the history of independent gaming. As they transitioned into the development of this new epic, the team also changed their fundamental approach to how they interact with their most dedicated players. After the somewhat rocky and bug-filled launch of the original game, they decided that for their next project, they would involve the community much earlier in the process through the use of public beta branches. This system allowed fans to volunteer their time to play unfinished versions of the software, acting as a massive, decentralized army of testers. Instead of being a crutch for the developers, this became a powerful way to tap into the passion of the fanbase. Thousands of players were eager to help hunt down glitches, report on balance issues, and provide feedback on how the new movement systems felt in practice. This transparency helped build an incredible amount of trust between the studio and the players. It meant that by the time a patch was officially released to the general public, it had already been battle-tested by the people who knew the game best. This collaborative approach to development is one of the reasons why the team has been able to maintain such a high level of quality while remaining a very small group. They turned their fans into a vital part of the development cycle, ensuring that the final product would live up to the impossible expectations set by the first game. The team also looked deeper into the natural world to find inspiration for the new challenges Hornet would face. While the first game drew heavily from beetles and moths, the sequel looks toward the more aggressive and predatory side of the insect kingdom, specifically hunting wasps. These creatures are known for their terrifying efficiency, often paralyzing their prey and dragging them back to specialized nests. This biological horror served as the foundation for several of the new enemy behaviors in the sequel's world. The developers wanted the combat to feel sharper, faster, and more predatory than the knight's more defensive, shell-like style. By studying the way real wasps move and hunt, they were able to create encounters that feel instinctively dangerous. It's another example of how the team uses real-world science to ground their fantasy world. They don't just make up monsters. They look at the existing horrors of nature and figure out how to translate those strategies into a gaming experience. This attention to biological detail makes the ecosystem of the game feel like a living, breathing place with its own internal logic and food chain, rather than just a series of random enemies for the player to hit. However, even with this deep inspiration and the help of community testers, the early days of any project are fraught with balance issues. When the team first started showing off the new world, some of the early boss encounters were notoriously overtuned. Fights like the Moorwing or the Sister Splinter became legendary among the early testers for being almost impossibly difficult. These bosses were designed to test the limits of Hornet's new acrobatic skills, but the developers initially pushed the numbers too high. New players found themselves hitting a wall of frustration before they even had a chance to understand the core mechanics. This was a crucial learning moment for the team. They realized that they had become so good at playing their own game that they had lost sight of what a fair challenge looked like for a newcomer. They had to step back and perform a series of payout adjustments, lowering the damage and health of these early encounters to ensure that the player felt encouraged rather than defeated. It shows the incredible difficulty of balancing an action game, what feels like a perfectly tuned dance. To a developer who has played the fight 10,000 times can feel like a chaotic, unfair mess to a player seeing it for the first time. This struggle for balance extended even to the most basic enemies in the world. For a long time, the team couldn't figure out why certain regions of the map felt so much more punishing than others, even when the bosses were well-tuned. It turned out that there was a subtle math error in the way damage was being calculated for several grunt enemies, such as the sand carvers. These small creatures were accidentally dealing more damage than their animations and telegraphs suggested, leading to players feeling cheated during regular exploration. The developers had to go back and manually adjust the internal values for dozens of enemies to bring them in line with the intended difficulty curve. It is a reminder that in game design, difficulty isn't just about the moves a boss makes. It's about the underlying math that governs every interaction. Even a tiny error in a spreadsheet can turn a fun exploration session into a frustrating slog. Fixing these invisible numbers was a massive part of the polish phase, ensuring that the game felt challenging but always mathematically fair. The team's obsession with these tiny details sometimes reached hilarious heights, as seen in the infamous Peep Pod Collider update. In one of the internal patches, there was a specific note about slightly increasing the collider scale for a minor environmental plant called a peep pod. For weeks, players had been complaining that they were swinging their weapons at these plants to collect their contents, only to have the blade pass right through them. It was a tiny, insignificant issue that most studios would have ignored, but for Team Cherry, it was a point of pride. They spent hours tweaking the physics boxes of a single piece of background vegetation just to ensure that the feel of hitting the plant was satisfying and consistent. This is the kind of detail that defines their work. They understand that a masterpiece isn't built from grand visions alone. It is built from thousands of tiny successful interactions. If hitting a plant doesn't feel right, then the whole world feels a little less real. By prioritizing these microscopic fixes, they ensured that the kingdom remained a place of tactile, reliable physics. This level of care also had to be applied to the game's internal economy, which underwent several massive revisions during development. Early versions of the world were notoriously stingy, with players struggling to afford basic upgrades or even the fee to use a bench. This created a situation where players were forced to grind for hours just to make basic progress, which killed the momentum of the story. Team Cherry eventually realized they had accidentally created a bug-themed recession. To fix it, they had to implement a series of stimulus updates, significantly increasing the rewards for finding relics, courier deliveries, and courier-style missions. They wanted the player to feel wealthy and capable, encouraged to explore and experiment with different equipment, rather than hoarding every single coin for a single vital upgrade. By boosting the payouts across the board, they transformed the economy of the world from a source of frustration into a rewarding system that encouraged curiosity. It's a fascinating look at how a developer has to think like an economist, ensuring that the currency flow of their world matches the emotional pacing of the adventure. Despite all this careful planning, the project was still plagued by several devastating high-level glitches that could completely ruin a player's progress. One of the most terrifying issues discovered during development occurred during a dramatic sequence known as the slab escape. In certain versions of the software, a logic error could cause the game to permanently remove the player's cloak after the sequence finished. Since the cloak is a vital tool for movement and survival, losing it essentially bricked the entire save file, leaving the player stranded and unable to progress. This was a nightmare scenario for the developers, as it hit right at the intersection of a scripted story event and a core gameplay mechanic. They had to perform deep digital surgery on the sequence's instructions to ensure that the player's equipment was always properly restored. It served as a harsh reminder of how fragile a complex game can be. A single line of faulty logic in a cutscene can destroy dozens of hours of player effort. Similar issues were found in the game's late-game wishes system. These were complex side quests that were intended to be the ultimate challenges for completionists, with titles like Infestation Operation and Beast in the Bells. However, as the game's world grew in complexity, these quests began to conflict with other story triggers, leading to situations where they would become impossible to complete. A player might spend hours tracking down every requirement for a wish, only to find that the final interaction wouldn't trigger because they had already spoken to a certain NPC or completed a different boss fight. For a completionist, this is the ultimate frustration, to be locked out of a goal by a hidden conflict in the software's rules. The team had to build a series of complex checkpoints within the internal logic to ensure that these quests remained viable regardless of the order in which the player tackled the world's challenges. It was an immense task of narrative and technical coordination, proving that the more freedom you give a player, the harder it is to ensure their journey remains unbroken. There were also happy accidents that the team eventually had to remove for the sake of the game's integrity, such as the levitation bug. For a brief period during the testing phase, players discovered that by bouncing off certain projectiles with a very specific timing, they could trick the game's physics engine into giving them permanent, uncontrolled flight. While this was incredibly fun and allowed players to soar over some of the most difficult platforming sections in the game, it completely broke the intended challenge of the world's design. The developers were forced to patch it out, though they did so with a bit of a heavy heart, as they loved seeing the creative ways players would try to break their gravity. They wanted the player to feel powerful, but not so powerful that the world stopped being dangerous. This delicate dance between allowing for player creativity and maintaining a sense of threat is one of the most difficult parts of being an independent creator. You want your fans to feel like they've discovered something special, but you also have to protect the soul of the game's difficulty. Sometimes the bugs were less about physics and more about the social systems of the world, like the courier and mail rewards. In certain builds, players found that the rewards they were supposed to receive for completing long-distance deliveries would simply vanish into thin air, or the NPCs responsible for the deliveries would stop appearing entirely. This was particularly frustrating because these rewards often included vital weapon materials or rare health upgrades. The team realized that their mail system was being overloaded by too many simultaneous requests from different parts of the map. They had to redesign the way the game tracked these deliveries, essentially creating a more robust postal service within the software instructions. It is a funny thought. A team of brilliant artists and designers spending their week figuring out why a bug wouldn't deliver a letter. But in a game of this scale, those small interactions are the glue that holds the entire experience together. If the mail doesn't work, the player's sense of reward is broken. Even the way the game handled the knight's memories and flashbacks could lead to strange inconsistencies. There were sections of the world where the knight's abilities, like the craft bind, would behave differently for no apparent reason, confusing players who had spent dozens of hours mastering the muscle memory of the combat. These memory sequences were actually running on a slightly different set of rules than the main game, a technical shortcut that the team had taken early in development. When they realized this was causing input confusion for their most dedicated players, they had to go back and unify the logic across every single part of the experience. They wanted the night to feel consistent, whether you were in the present day or exploring a dream of the past. It shows that even a narrative choice, like a flashback, can have major technical repercussions that require months of cleanup to get right. One of the most infamous technical hurdles involved a massive boss fight in the Deepnest region. This battle featured a recurring rival named Lace, and for a long time the encounter was plagued by a soft lock glitch. If the player used a specific tool-based deflection at the exact moment Lace performed a certain dash, the entire fight would freeze. The music would keep playing and the environment would still be animated, but both the player and the boss would be stuck in place, unable to move or take damage. This was a particularly difficult bug to hunt down because it only happened under a very specific set of circumstances that were hard to reproduce in a controlled environment. The team had to spend weeks analyzing the collision events of that specific arena before they finally found the single line of logic that was causing the freeze. It was a stressful period for the studio, as this was one of the centerpiece fights of the entire adventure. They knew that if they couldn't fix it, one of their most impressive set pieces would be remembered more for its glitches than for its combat. There was also the strange case of the dimension-hopping silk snippers. These small, agile enemies were known for their ability to cling to walls and jump across gaps, but in the Chapel of the Reaper region, they were accidentally jumping right through the walls and into the empty, void space outside the map. Players would be in the middle of a fight when suddenly their opponents would just vanish into the solid rock, only to continue attacking with projectiles from behind the wall. It made the fight feel like you were being hunted by ghosts. The team had to go through that entire region and manually thicken the collision barriers to ensure that the enemies stayed within the playable area. It is a reminder that in a 2D world, a wall is only as solid as the math behind it. If the math is off by even a fraction of a percent, the world's inhabitants can go for a walk in the fourth dimension. Perhaps the most visually bizarre glitch was the upside-down Hornet bug. Under certain conditions, if Hornet took damage while using a claw mirror ability and was simultaneously hit by a knockback effect, the game's orientation logic would flip. Hornet would spend the rest of the session standing on the ceiling, with all of her controls inverted. While this was hilariously funny for about 5 minutes, it made the game almost impossible to play seriously. The team had to write a specific reset command that would force the character's orientation back to normal whenever she touched the ground or entered a new room. It was one of those bugs that reminded the team of how many different systems are constantly talking to each other behind the scenes. A simple interaction between an item and an enemy attack was enough to turn the entire world upside down. These are the kinds of stories that define the life of a developer, a constant battle against the unintended consequences of their own creativity. Throughout all of these struggles, the team remained grounded in the reality of their surroundings in Adelaide. They never lost that scrappy office in a cheap building energy, even as they became one of the most famous studios in the world. They continued to work closely with their friends in the local scene, like the team at Shark Jump, who continued to provide support for the complicated process of bringing their work to new audiences. This spirit of collaboration and community is the true secret behind the success of their work. They didn't try to be a massive corporate machine. They stayed a small group of friends in a quiet city, focusing on the tiny details that make a game feel human. They understood that the soul of a project isn't found in the marketing budget or the size of the team, but in the hundreds of minor fixes, the improvised voice lines, and the shared passion of everyone involved. Hallownest and the world that comes after it are not just products of software and art. They are products of a specific time, a specific place, and a specific group of people who refuse to let their trash idea die. The reality of how this small group of people managed to survive the long, grueling years of development is a story of extreme financial discipline and the incredible, quiet support of the people around them. As we have seen, the budget for the original project was essentially a handful of change in the eyes of the professional gaming industry. To make that small amount of money last, the team had to operate with a level of frugality that would break most modern studios. They didn't have a human resources department, they didn't have a marketing team, and they certainly didn't have a massive server room filled with expensive equipment. They had their personal computers, a few shared desks, and a deep, unshakable belief that what they were building was something special. This humble beginning meant that every decision they made had to be efficient. They couldn't afford to waste time on ideas that didn't work, which is why so much of the game's logic is built around elegant, simple systems that interact in complex ways. This efficiency was also a byproduct of their work environment. The small office in Adelaide wasn't just a place to work. It was a pressure cooker where ideas could be tested and refined in real time. Because Ari and William were sitting right next to each other, they didn't need to schedule meetings or send long emails to discuss a change in the knight's jump height or the color of a specific background element. They could simply turn their chairs around and talk. This immediate feedback loop allowed them to iterate at a pace that would be impossible for a larger team. It also meant that the soul of the game remained consistent. Every part of the world, from the deepest reaches of the abyss to the highest peaks of the Crystal Mound, was filtered through the same two sets of eyes. This is why the kingdom feels so cohesive and whole. It isn't a collection of disparate ideas from 100 different designers, but a single unified vision that was nurtured in a small, quiet room. That unified vision was also protected by the team's decision to stay independent for as long as possible. They were approached by several publishers during the development cycle, but they turned them down because they didn't want to lose control over their creation. They were afraid that a publisher would force them to simplify the difficulty, add intrusive tutorials, or cut out the more obscure and challenging parts of the lore. By staying small and living on leftovers and small bills, they bought themselves the freedom to be as weird and uncompromising as they wanted. They understood that the very things that made the game difficult to market, its opacity, its brutal challenge, and its lack of hand-holding, were exactly the things that would make it a masterpiece. They chose the path of greatest resistance because they knew it would lead to the most rewarding result. One of the most fascinating aspects of their creative process was the way they handled the lore of the world. They didn't start with a massive 1,000-page document detailing every king and every war. Instead, they built the world piece by piece, allowing the history to emerge naturally from the environments they were drawing. If Ari drew a strange, shattered statue in a corner of a room, William would then figure out who that statue represented and why it was broken. They worked like archaeologists in reverse, building the ruins first and then figuring out the civilization that had left them behind. This environmental first approach to storytelling is why the world feels so authentic. The history of Hallownest isn't just told to you. It is baked into the very stones of the kingdom. Every crumbling pillar and every forgotten mural is a piece of a puzzle that the player has to solve for themselves. This sense of mystery was also enhanced by the team's decision to use a very specific type of animation. Because Ari came from a high-level background in hand-drawn animation, he brought a level of fluidity and character to the bugs that is rarely seen in 2D games. Every frame was drawn by hand, then scanned into the computer and cleaned up to maintain that organic, slightly sketchy feel. They didn't use skeletal animation or procedural tools to move the characters. Every single frame of a boss's attack or a citizen's idle movement was a unique drawing. This was an immense amount of work, but it gave the world a handcrafted quality that makes it stand out from the polished, often sterile visuals of other modern titles. You can feel the weight and the effort in every movement. It makes the bugs feel like actual living creatures with their own weight and biology, rather than just digital puppets. This organic approach to the visuals also extended to the way they designed the game's regions. They didn't want the underground to feel like a series of identical caves. They wanted each area to have its own unique atmosphere, ecology, and sense of history. This led to the incredible diversity we see in locations like the Green Path, with its lush, vibrant plant life, or the City of Tears, with its constant, melancholy rain. To achieve this, the team spent a massive amount of time on atmospheric layers. They used things like falling particles, moving foreground shadows, and complex lighting effects to give each room a sense of air and depth. They wanted the player to feel the humidity of the fungal wastes and the biting cold of the snowy peaks. By focusing so heavily on the sensory details of the environment, they created a world that feels much larger than it actually is. You aren't just looking at a screen, you are sinking into a place. The technical logic that holds all of these layers together is a masterpiece of simplified engineering. Because the team was so small, they couldn't afford to build a massive custom engine from scratch. Instead, they used the Unity framework, but stripped it down to its most basic elements. They focused on creating a set of internal rules that were incredibly robust and predictable. For example, the way the knight interacts with walls and floors is governed by a very simple set of collision instructions that never vary. This consistency is what allows for the frame-perfect movement that the community loves. The player knows exactly how the character will react in any given situation because the underlying logic is so disciplined. There are no random physics events or unpredictable momentum shifts. Everything is digital, sharp, and reliable. This technical discipline is the unsung hero of the game's success. It provides the solid ground upon which all of the artistic and narrative flourishes can stand. That solid ground also allowed the team to experiment with some very radical ideas for how a player should navigate a world. One of the most controversial decisions they made was the map system. In most modern games, the map is a given. It fills in automatically as you move, and it often shows you exactly where you are with a bright, flashing icon. Team Cherry felt that this removed the joy and the danger of exploration. They wanted the player to feel genuinely lost in an ancient, forgotten kingdom. This led to the creation of Cornifer, the map maker who you have to find in every new region. And even once you have the map, you still have to find a bench to update it with the areas you've discovered. This creates a cycle of exploration and rest that perfectly matches the tone of the game. It forces you to pay attention to your surroundings, to look for landmarks, and to rely on your own sense of direction. It makes the act of mapping the world feel like a hard-won victory rather than a passive background task. This philosophy of making the player work for it is also present in the way the team handled the geo-economy. In the early stages of the game, every single coin feels incredibly valuable. You find yourself carefully weighing whether to buy a new charm, an extra map marker, or a vital piece of a health vessel. The team wanted the player to feel the weight of their currency. They didn't want you to be showered in gold from the very beginning. By making money scarce and deaths potentially devastating, they ensured that every decision the player made felt meaningful. This creates a powerful sense of investment. When you finally save up enough to buy that expensive upgrade, it feels like a genuine achievement. It also reinforces the theme of the kingdom's collapse. Resources are rare, and the world is a harsh, unforgiving place where nothing is given for free. The Stag fast travel system is another example of how the team integrated mechanical needs with world building. Instead of just having a menu where you can teleport between locations, they created a physical, living creature that connects the different regions. The Stag isn't just a shortcut. He is a character with his own history, his own voice, and his own tragic perspective on the fall of the kingdom. Every time you call him, you are reminded of the scale of the world and the loneliness of being the last of your kind. The team chose this physical form of fast travel because it keeps the player grounded in the world's geography. You aren't just jumping from point A to point B. You are traveling through the tunnels of an ancient transit system. It maintains the sense of immersion and keeps the player connected to the reality of the underground. As the knight grows in power throughout the journey, the team carefully managed the power curve to ensure that the sense of danger never truly vanished. The nail upgrades are a perfect illustration of this. Each time you improve your weapon, the knight's damage increases, but the enemies in the new regions also become tougher and more complex. They didn't want the player to ever feel like they could just breeze through the world. They wanted you to always feel like a small, fragile creature in a vast and dangerous land. This balance is incredibly difficult to achieve in a world as open as Hallownest, where a player could potentially wander into a high-level area very early in their journey. The team used mechanical gates, like the double jump or the dash, to guide the player's progress without ever making the world feel like it was closed. You are always free to explore, but the world quietly tells you when you aren't yet ready for what lies ahead. The charm system provided the tactical depth that allowed players to customize their experience to suit their own playstyle. By using a limited number of notches, the team forced the player to make difficult choices. Do you focus on pure damage, or do you prioritize defense and healing? Do you want to move faster, or do you want your spells to be more powerful? There is no perfect build, which encourages players to experiment and find the combinations that work best for them. The overcharm mechanic was the final brilliant touch, allowing the player to break the rules of the system at a massive risk. It is a perfect metaphor for the entire game. You can have all the power you want, but it will cost you dearly. It rewards skill and confidence while punishing overconfidence and greed. The team's dedication to these deep, interconnected systems is what allowed the game to grow into the massive success it eventually became. They didn't just build a game, they built an entire ecosystem of mechanics that all work together to support the central themes of exploration, struggle, and discovery. Even the things that were added later as part of the free expansions were integrated with the same level of care and attention. The Godhome expansion, for example, could have been just a simple series of boss battles. Instead, they built a massive atmospheric world within the mind of a god, complete with its own lore, its own unique characters, and a stunning visual identity. They never took the easy way out. Every time they had the chance to simplify or cut corners, they chose to go deeper, to add more detail, and to make the world feel even more real. This obsessive attention to detail is also why the community's relationship with the game is so intense. Fans have spent thousands of hours searching for every hidden wall, every line of dialogue, and every subtle clue about the kingdom's history. The team provided a world that was deep enough to withstand that kind of scrutiny. They didn't leave any loose ends or careless mistakes. Every part of the world has a reason for being there. This level of respect for the player's intelligence and curiosity is rare in an industry that often treats its audience as passive consumers. Team Cherry treated their players as fellow explorers, as people who were capable of uncovering the truth for themselves. This mutual respect is the foundation of the game's enduring legacy. As the focus of the studio eventually shifted toward the sequel, they carried these same principles with them. They knew that the expectations for the next project were impossibly high, but they refused to be rushed. They understood that the magic of the first game wasn't something that could be manufactured on a schedule. It required the same slow, painstaking process of iteration, experimentation, and refinement. They were willing to spend years building a new kingdom from the ground up, ensuring that every room, every enemy, and every mechanic felt just as perfect as the ones they had created before. They weren't just making a sequel, they were continuing a conversation with their fans. A conversation about what it means to build a world that is worth getting lost in. The transition from the first game to the sequel also allowed the team to look back at the things they had learned during those long, difficult years in Adelaide. They realized that their small size was their greatest strength, but also their biggest challenge. They had to find ways to scale their ambitions without losing the human touch that made their work so special. This led to a more refined development process, where they used the feedback from their community to help guide their decisions. They stayed true to their roots, remaining a small, independent group of friends who were simply trying to make something they could be proud of. They didn't let the success change their fundamental approach to art. They still drew every frame, still improvised the voices, and still lived in the same quiet, affordable city. The legacy of Hallownest is not just the game itself, but the story of how it was made. It is a story about the power of independence, the importance of a support system, and the incredible things that can happen when a small group of people refuses to give up on a trash idea. It is a reminder that you don't need a massive studio or a multi-million-dollar budget to create a masterpiece. You just need a few dedicated people in a small room, a lot of passion, and the willingness to spend years obsessing over the tiniest details. The ruins of the Underground Kingdom are a monument to that dedication, a place that will continue to inspire and challenge players for generations to come. And as we wait for the next chapter of the journey, we can take comfort in the fact that the same people who built the first world are still hard at work, making sure that the next one is just as beautiful, just as haunting, and just as hollow as it needs to be. The depth of the world building is perhaps most evident in the way the regions of the kingdom are connected. The geography of Hallownest isn't just a collection of levels, it is a logical, coherent space. The way the water from the Blue Lake drips down to create the rain in the City of Tears is a perfect example of this. It is a tiny, logical detail that most players might not even notice, but it gives the world a sense of physical reality. Everything is connected. The sewers lead to the waterways, the mines lead to the peaks, and the deepest pits lead to the abyss. This verticality is central to the experience. The further down you go, the more ancient and dangerous the world becomes. You are literally descending into the history of the kingdom, moving through the layers of time as you move through the layers of the earth. This vertical storytelling is also mirrored in the knight's own progression. As you gain more abilities, you are able to reach higher and deeper areas that were previously inaccessible. But these abilities aren't just keys to doors. They are fundamental changes in how you interact with the world. The Mantis Claw, for example, doesn't just let you climb walls. It changes how you think about every room you enter. Suddenly, the vertical space is just as important as the horizontal space. The Crystal Heart doesn't just let you fly over gaps. It changes your sense of scale and momentum. The team wanted the players' growth to feel like an expansion of their own physical capabilities. They wanted you to feel like you were slowly becoming a part of the world, mastering its challenges through sheer physical and mental evolution. That sense of evolution is what makes the final encounters of the game so powerful. By the time you reach the ultimate bosses, you have mastered every trick and every technique the game has to offer. The battle isn't just between two characters. It is a test of everything you have learned over the dozens of hours you've spent in the ruins. The team designed these fights to be the ultimate exam, the final proof of your mastery. They are difficult, yes, but they are also incredibly fair. Every attack can be dodged, every move can be countered, and every victory is a result of your own skill and determination. When you finally land that last hit, you don't feel like you've beaten a game. You feel like you've survived an epic ordeal. The community that has grown around the game is a direct reflection of this level of investment. Because the team provided such a deep and rewarding experience, the fans have responded with an incredible amount of creative energy. From stunning pieces of fan art to complex lore theories and high-level speedrun techniques, the community has turned the game into a living, breathing culture. Team Cherry has always been supportive of this, acknowledging that their work now belongs to the fans as much as it belongs to them. They have created a world that people want to live in, even if that world is a decaying kingdom full of tragic bugs. It is a rare and beautiful thing when a piece of art can spark that much passion in so many people. As we look toward the future and the arrival of the sequel, it is clear that the team's philosophy hasn't changed. They are still the same small group of creators, still obsessing over the tiniest details, and still refusing to compromise on their vision. They know that the journey is just as important as the destination. They are taking their time, making sure that every part of the new world is as rich and as rewarding as the one they built before. They are staying independent, staying scrappy, and staying true to the spirit that made the first game a masterpiece. The ruins of Hallownest may be silent, but the story is far from over. And as long as there are people willing to get lost in the dark, seeking answers among the ancient stones, the legacy of the Silent Knight will continue to grow. The transition from a small-scale jam project to a worldwide phenomenon is a testament to the fact that great art can come from anywhere. You don't need to be in a major tech hub or have a massive marketing machine behind you. You just need a great idea and the discipline to see it through. Team Cherry's journey from Hungry Knight to Hollow Knight is an inspiration to independent creators everywhere. It shows that even a trash idea, if nurtured with enough love and hard work, can turn into something that changes the world. It is a story of grit, passion, and the incredible power of a few dedicated people in a small room in Adelaide. The architecture of the underground world itself serves as a silent narrator, guiding the player through the rise and fall of a civilization that dreamed too big. If you look at the different styles of buildings and structures, you can see the varying priorities of the bugs who lived there. The crossroads are simple and functional, built for trade and travel. The City of Tears is ornate and grand, built for a nobility that wanted to show off its wealth and its connection to the king. The White Palace is sterile and geometric, built by a mind that craved order and perfection above all else. By using these different architectural styles, the team was able to give each region a distinct social identity. You aren't just moving through different levels, you are moving through the different neighborhoods of a massive, complex society. It makes the tragedy of the collapse feel more personal as you see the abandoned homes, the shuttered shops, and the ruined monuments of a people who once had lives just as complex as our own. This sense of social history is also found in the characters you meet along the way. Most of the NPCs aren't heroes or villains, they are just survivors. They are people who are trying to make sense of a world that has already ended. Whether it's the quiet scholar Quirrell, the ambitious warrior Hornet, or the cynical merchant Sly, each one has their own unique perspective on the kingdom's fate. The team wrote these characters with a great deal of empathy, ensuring that even the most minor interaction felt like it was part of a larger, ongoing story. They didn't use the characters just to give the player tasks. They used them to provide emotional anchors in an otherwise lonely and desolate landscape. Your relationships with these characters are what give the journey its heart. When a character leaves, or when their story reaches a tragic conclusion, you feel a genuine sense of loss, because the team made you care about their tiny bug-like lives. The metaphysical rules of the world, the balance between soul, void, and infection, are the underlying framework that gives the story its weight. The team managed to create a mythology that feels ancient and established, as though it was pulled from a real book of folklore. The way these different forces interact is never fully explained in a single place, which forces the player to piece the truth together for themselves. You learn about the soul through your own abilities and the experiments in the sanctum. You learn about the void through the horrors of the abyss and the history of the king's failures. You learn about the infection through the orange glow that permeates the world and the mindless behavior of the husks. By making these forces tangible and present in the gameplay, the team ensured that the lore never felt dry or academic. It is a living, breathing part of the experience, something that you are constantly interacting with as you fight, explore, and survive. The technical achievements of the project are also worth revisiting, especially considering the lack of traditional resources. The team used a layering system for their art that allowed them to create incredibly complex visual effects without a massive amount of technical overhead. By stacking dozens of individual drawings and effects on top of one another, they were able to create the illusion of a world that is constantly in motion. The falling rain in the city, the drifting spores in the wastes, and the shimmering crystals in the peaks are all made of simple, hand-drawn elements that are layered together to create a rich, immersive atmosphere. This analog approach to digital art is what gives the game its unique texture. It doesn't look like it was generated by a computer. It looks like it was painted by a human. This distinction is subtle but profound, as it creates a sense of warmth that is often missing from high-end blockbuster games. The way the team managed their development timeline is also a lesson in patience and commitment. They didn't rush to release the game as soon as it was playable. They took the time to add the extra details that make the world feel complete. They added the hidden lore, the optional bosses, and the secret rooms that most players might never even find. They understood that these things are what make a game feel special. They provide the sense of discovery and mystery that keeps players engaged for years. They were willing to spend months on content that they knew only a fraction of their audience would ever see, because they knew that for those players, the discovery would be an unforgettable experience. This commitment to hidden depth is what transformed the game from a good action platformer into a legendary masterpiece. As they look toward the future, the team continues to embrace this same philosophy. They aren't trying to make a game that is bigger just for the sake of size. They are trying to make a world that is just as deep, just as rewarding, and just as full of secrets as the one that came before. They are taking all of the lessons they learned in that small office in Adelaide and applying them to a new kingdom, a new hero, and a new set of challenges. They are staying true to themselves, staying independent, and staying focused on the tiny details that make their work so unique. The journey of the Silent Night may have ended, but the spirit of Team Cherry is just getting started. And as long as they are the ones telling the stories, we can be sure that the world will be a place of wonder, danger, and endless discovery. The impact of the game on the wider industry cannot be overstated. It has shown that there's a massive audience for challenging, atmospheric, and deeply immersive 2D games. It has inspired a whole new generation of independent creators to follow their own trash ideas and to build worlds that are uncompromising and unique. It has proven that you don't need a massive team or a huge budget to compete with the biggest studios in the world. You just need a unified vision, a talented group of people, and the willingness to sacrifice everything to see that vision realized. The success of the project is a win for independent art everywhere, a reminder that the best stories are often the ones that are told from the edges, far away from the noise and the influence of the mainstream. In the end, Hallownest is more than just a place on a map. It is a reflection of the people who built it. It carries their humor, their struggles, their passions, and their deep love for the history of gaming. It is a place that was built with human hands, improvised voices, and a level of dedication that is almost impossible to find in the corporate world. It is a world that invites us to slow down, to pay attention, and to find beauty in the ruins. And as we continue to explore its depths, we are reminded that the most important things in life, like the most important things in games, are often the ones that are hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for us to find them. The culmination of this long, winding journey through the cooling crust of the earth and the flickering lights of the imagination brings us to the ultimate peak of the experience, the God Home expansion. This final, massive update was more than just a collection of bosses. It was a profound reimagining of what the Knight's journey actually meant. It introduced a new metaphysical layer to the world, a place where the gods of Hallownest are not just monsters to be defeated, but entities to be worshipped and understood through combat. The creation of this realm was an immense undertaking for such a tiny studio. They had to revisit every single encounter they had ever designed, refining the logic and updating the visual effects to match the higher, divine stakes of the pantheons. This wasn't a task they took lightly. They saw it as the final definitive statement on the Knight's power. By surviving these trials, the player is essentially transcending the physical world and entering the realm of the eternal. This sense of transcendence is most visible in the absolute Radiance encounter, which is widely regarded as the most difficult challenge in the entire project. The developers wanted this final hurdle to feel fundamentally different from everything that had come before. They pushed the speed, the complexity, and the visual intensity to the absolute limit of what the software could handle. Every beam of light and every fluttering sword was designed to overwhelm the player's senses, forcing them into a state of pure, instinctual reaction. But beyond the difficulty, there was a deeper lore purpose. By defeating the Absolute Radiance, the Knight is not just killing a moth, it is consuming the very concept of the light. The final, haunting cutscene, where the Knight transforms into the massive, many-armed Shade Lord, is the emotional and thematic payoff for every hour spent in the abyss. It represents the void-given focus, a moment where the darkness finally finds a shape and a purpose. Team Cherry spent weeks debating the implications of this ending, realizing that it fundamentally changed the balance of power in their universe. It turned the silent protagonist from a tragic failure into the most powerful force in existence. The Land of Storm's secret, hidden within the God Home, provides even more context for this divine struggle. To reach this area, a player must complete all the pantheons with every single restrictive binding active, a task so difficult that only a tiny fraction of the community has ever achieved it. The reward is a brief glimpse into an even older era of the world, a place where the ancestors of the God-Seekers once lived. It shows that the history of Hallownest is just one chapter in a much larger, more ancient story. Team Cherry wanted to reward the most dedicated players with a mystery that they couldn't fully solve, a reminder that no matter how much you explore, There will always be things hidden in the shadows of the past. This commitment to rewarding the impossible is what has kept the community engaged for so many years. They know that if they look hard enough, they will always find another layer of history waiting to be uncovered. As the team finally closed the book on the first project and began to focus entirely on the sequel, they found themselves in a very different position than they had been in 2013. They were no longer the scrappy little prototype hunters. They were the creators of a global phenomenon. This brought a new kind of pressure, a burden of expectation that could have easily crushed a smaller group. But instead of expanding their team or moving to a bigger, more prestigious city, they stayed in their quiet Adelaide office and maintained their original tiny circle. They understood that the very thing that made their work special, the intimacy and the direct human communication, would be lost if they became a massive studio. They chose to protect their creative soul by staying small, even if it meant that their next project would take much longer to reach the public. The development of the sequel, set in the kingdom of Farloom, represents a massive evolution in their design philosophy. While the first game was about descending into the ruins of the past, the new journey is about ascending toward the peak of a shining citadel. This vertical shift is more than just a change in direction. It is a fundamental shift in the feel of the world. Hornet's movement is built around silk and thread, a much more agile and graceful set of mechanics than the knight's heavy, deliberate strikes. She can zip across rooms, cling to walls with a spear, and use a variety of tools to manipulate her environment. The team had to build an entirely new physics framework to support this increased speed. They wanted the player to feel like a predator in motion, a warrior who is always moving and always looking for an opening. This required a much more complex set of internal instructions for the software, as every jump and every dash had to be perfectly tuned to Hornet's unique silhouette. The music for this new adventure also underwent a significant transformation. Christopher Larkin, returning as the composer, decided to move away from the heavy piano and orchestral swells of the first game, focusing instead on stringed instruments like cellos and violins. He wanted the score to reflect Hornet's character, sharp, elegant, and filled with a kind of kinetic energy. The music in Farloom is faster and more rhythmic, matching the increased pace of the combat. Larkin spent months experimenting with different string arrangements to find a sound that felt like silk in a musical form. This attention to the texture of the audio is a perfect example of how the team works. They don't just want the music to be good, they want it to be inseparable from the identity of the world. Every note is designed to make you feel like you are part of Hornet's dance. The long wait for the sequel has become a phenomenon of its own within the gaming world. Fans have spent years analyzing every screenshot, every brief clip of footage, and every cryptic comment from the developers. The clown memes and the frantic hype during every major gaming event have become a shared cultural experience for the community. But beneath the jokes, there is a deep, genuine respect for Team Cherry's process. The fans understand that the reason the game is taking so long is that the developers are refusing to release anything less than a masterpiece. They are still that same small group of friends in Adelaide, obsessing over the Peep Pod colliders and the timing of every single frame. They are willing to take the time to ensure that every room in Farloom is as detailed and as rewarding as the halls of Hallownest. They aren't following a corporate schedule. They are following their own internal compass of quality. The legacy of the project is also preserved through its incredible physical releases. In an era where digital downloads are the norm, the team partnered with companies like Fangamer to create physical editions that are essentially works of art in themselves. These boxes are filled with detailed maps, high-quality pins, and beautiful art books that provide even more insight into the world's creation. They wanted the player to have something tangible to hold, a physical connection to the kingdom they had spent so much time exploring. For the collectors in the community, these editions are the ultimate tribute to the game's success. They turn the digital experience into a physical monument, a way of saying that this story matters enough to be kept on a shelf. As we look back at the vessel lore, the tragedy of the king's plan becomes even more profound. The realization that the night is just one of thousands of failed children sacrificed in a desperate attempt to save a doomed kingdom is the emotional anchor of the entire story. The role of the White Lady, the root of the kingdom, adds another layer of sorrow. She bound herself in her own gardens to prevent her insatiable nature from creating even more children for the sacrifice. Her dialogue is filled with a sense of regret and ancient guilt that colors your understanding of the king's actions. The team managed to create a family tragedy on a cosmic scale, a story where the parents of the world are just as flawed and as broken as the world itself. It is this human core hidden beneath the shells and the shadows that makes the story so unforgettable. The connection between the bug's world and our own sense of loss and discovery is what makes the experience so universal. We all understand what it feels like to walk through the ruins of something that was once great, to seek answers in a place that has already forgotten the questions. The team at Team Cherry took that feeling and turned it into a digital reality. They built a place where we could be alone, where we could be challenged, and where we could find beauty in the darkness. They proved that a game doesn't need to be loud or flashy to be important. It just needs to be honest. It needs to have a soul. And Hallownest has a soul that is as deep and as vast as the abyss itself. The humble atmosphere of the Adelaide office has remained unchanged, even as the studio's fame has reached every corner of the globe. They still value the quiet, the isolation, and the freedom to work at their own pace. They have shown that you don't need to be part of the system to change the industry. You can be a few guys in a cheap building, living on leftovers and passion, and still create something that millions of people will love. Their journey is a powerful reminder that the most important thing a creator can have is a unified vision and the courage to follow it, no matter how long it takes. They didn't build a game to make a profit. They built a game to tell a story. And because they focused on the story, the profit followed. As the final reflections on this masterpiece come to a close, we are reminded once again of its origins. It all started with a trash idea, a bug that had to eat every 10 seconds to survive. From that frantic, failed prototype, a world of incredible beauty and complexity was born. It shows that there are no bad ideas in art, only ideas that haven't yet found their proper shape. Team Cherry had the patience to keep looking for that shape, even when the rest of the world was telling them to give up. They turned a game jam failure into a historical triumph, a hungry night into a hollow night. They taught us that if you are willing to descend deep enough into the dark, you will eventually find the light. The broader impact on the Metroidvania genre is something that will be discussed for decades. They didn't just iterate on the formula, they perfected it. They showed how to use environmental storytelling to its fullest potential, how to balance brutal difficulty with perfect control, and how to build a world that feels alive, even in its decay. They raised the bar for every independent creator who came after them, proving that indie is not a measure of quality, but a measure of freedom. They used their freedom to build a kingdom, and in doing so, they gave us a gift that will continue to resonate for as long as people play games. The final secrets of Farloom are still waiting for us, tucked away in a future that is being carefully crafted in that small Adelaide office. And while the wait may be long, we know that it will be worth it, because we know the people who are making it. We know that they are currently obsessing over the collision of a single leaf, the sound of a single footstep, and the history of a single broken statue. We know that they are putting their entire lives into every frame, just as they did before. And when we finally step into that new world, we will be reminded of why we fell in love with their work in the first place. We will be reminded that some things are worth the struggle, some mysteries are worth the time, and some worlds are worth getting lost in. The story of Hallownest is a story of a silent warrior who found a purpose in the ruins, but it is also the story of a small team that found a masterpiece in a mistake. It is a story of how a few thousand Australian dollars and a massive amount of heart can change an entire industry. It is a story of bugs and of the shadows that connect them all. And as the rain continues to fall in the city of tears and the crystals continue to sing in the peaks, we are left with a single profound truth, that even in a world that is hollow, there is always room for a soul. The journey that began in 2013 is not just a game, it is a monument to the human spirit's ability to find meaning in the dark. The architecture of the final part of this journey is built on the same principles as the first. It is a structure of dedication, a map of persistence, and a chronicle of what happens when you refuse to settle for anything less than perfection. Every technical hurdle, every narrative cut, and every minor fix was a step toward the summit. Team Cherry has reached that summit, not by following the path that everyone else took, but by carving their own way through the solid rock. They have earned their place among the legends, and they have done it on their own terms. As we look back on the entire history of the project, from the first sketch to the final pantheon, we can see the clear, straight line of their vision. They never wavered. They never compromised. They just kept digging. The final numbers of the project's history tell a story of incredible growth. What started with 58,000 UD and a few hundred backers ended with millions of copies sold and a legacy that will outlast the hardware it was played on. It is a reminder that in the world of art, the numbers that matter most aren't the sales figures or the frame rates, but the number of people who were moved by the experience. By that metric, Team Cherry has achieved a success that is almost impossible to calculate. They have created a world that lives on in the minds of their fans, a kingdom that will never truly be forgotten. And as we prepare for the next chapter, we can be certain that the same level of care and the same level of passion will be present in every single frame of the sequel. The philosophy of the small team has been vindicated by the sheer quality of their output. They have proven that a few people with a clear vision can do more than 1,000 people with a corporate mandate. They have shown that the human touch is the most valuable resource in game development. By keeping their team tiny, they kept their art pure. They kept their voices improvised, their drawings handcrafted, and their world unique. They showed us that the best way to make something big is to start by making it personal. Hallownest is a personal world, a place that feels like it was made specifically for the person playing it. It is a conversation between the artist and the explorer, a shared journey through the dark. In the end, the most enduring image of the entire project is that of the silent knight, sitting on a bench in the middle of a ruined kingdom. It is an image of peace in the midst of chaos, a moment of rest in a world that never stops trying to break you. It is a reflection of the developers themselves, sitting in their small office, surrounded by the chaos of a collapsing industry and finding the quiet strength to build something beautiful. They found their bench, their moment of rest, and they used it to give us a world that we can all call home. And as we step back out into the dark, ready for the next adventure, we carry that sense of peace with us. We know that no matter how difficult the path becomes, there is always a place to sit, a way to breathe, and a story worth telling.